Hello, curious minds. I'm the Cap Nat Storyteller, here to share a tale to keep you company tonight. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, get comfortable and let's dive in. Daniel stood in front of the massive building, its looming structure sending a chill through him. The city around it buzzed with life, but here, at the edge of the street, there was only silence. The building had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its cracked windows and rusted door handles told the story of decades of neglect. Yet, it was now the site of his new job. He had always been drawn to challenges, and this seemed like the perfect one. The old man who ran the building had seemed eager to hire him when he came across the ad. "Just need someone to clean up after hours," the man had said, his voice rasping as if he had seen too many years to count. "You'll be alone. Just make sure to lock up when you leave." Easy enough, Daniel had thought. But something about the place, even in broad daylight, unsettled him. He shook the thought away. He was here for the money, not to be afraid of a building. The first night, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. Daniel grabbed his broom and dustpan, starting on the main floor. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty halls, a constant reminder that he was alone. His every move felt amplified in the stillness of the building. He moved through the old offices, sweeping dust into piles, noticing the aged furniture and peeling wallpaper. The place reeked of something old, something forgotten. There were no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no movement. Just the endless, suffocating silence. By the time he reached the farthest part of the building, he began to feel it. The air seemed to change, growing colder. His breath clouded in front of him as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. His skin prickled, a sense of unease crawling up his spine. He glanced at the walls, their cracked surfaces and decaying paint forming grotesque patterns that seemed to shift in his peripheral vision. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. It was just the isolation, the silence. He was imagining things. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, he heard it. A faint whisper. At first, Daniel thought it was the wind or the creaking of the old structure settling. But as the seconds passed, the whisper became clearer, almost like someone, no, something, was calling his name. Daniel. His heart skipped a beat. He stopped in his tracks. The voice had come from behind him, but there was no one there. He turned around, scanning the hallway. The only thing he could see was the dim glow of the overhead lights. "Daniel," the voice repeated, a little louder this time. His blood ran cold. He knew no one else was supposed to be here. The old man had made that very clear. And yet, the voice continued, echoing through the empty halls, as if it was coming from all directions. He took a few steps forward, his legs shaking beneath him. The whisper seemed to guide him, leading him toward the back of the building. His curiosity got the better of him, and against his better judgment, he followed the voice. As he moved deeper into the building, the temperature dropped even further, his breath coming out in visible clouds. It was as if the very air was alive, suffocating him with a weight he couldn't explain. At the very end of the hall, Daniel saw something that stopped him cold. There, in the dim light, was a door. It looked old, older than the rest of the building, with a sign hanging loosely on the handle. It read, "Authorized personnel only." The door wasn't there when he first entered. He was sure of it. He had walked this hall countless times, but never once had he noticed this door. His mind screamed at him to turn around and leave. The voice was gone now, replaced by the heavy silence of the building. But the door, it called to him. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. It was cold, as if it hadn't been touched in years. As soon as he touched it, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The door creaked open slowly, a sound that made his heart race. Behind it was a dark room, so dark that the light from the hallway seemed to disappear as soon as it entered. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his mind battling between the urge to run and the pull of his curiosity. He stepped inside, his breath quickening. The room was empty, or so it seemed. The moment he entered, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, the sound reverberating through the building. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to turn around, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the room grew colder, colder than it had ever been. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against him, suffocating him. And then, he heard it, the faintest sound, like a breath, coming from somewhere in the darkness. Daniel. The voice was different now, rasping, almost a growl. Daniel's pulse raced. His heart hammered in his chest as he backed away, his eyes darting around, trying to see something, anything in the pitch-black room. But there was nothing. The whispers, the cold, the pressure, they were all closing in on him. He was no longer alone. Something was with him. Something that had been waiting for him to find this room. His stomach churned as the whispers grew louder, more intense. And then, in the darkness, a figure began to take shape, a shadowy form that seemed to shift with the darkness around it. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, what he had gotten himself into. But it was too late. The door behind him was locked. And the shadow was getting closer. Daniel's breath quickened, his chest tightening as the shadow in the darkened room began to grow, its outline becoming clearer and more distinct. It moved unnaturally, its shape twisting like a figure made of smoke or liquid, shifting in and out of the darkness with a mind of its own. He could feel it. It was getting closer. And worse, it was aware of him. Panic gripped his chest as he stumbled backward, his feet slipping against the cold, damp floor. His hands reached for the door, desperate to escape, but the handle refused to turn. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the deafening sound of his own fear. Sweat soaked his shirt, his fingers shaking as he clawed at the door, trying in vain to break free. The shadow was mere feet away now, its form almost solid, and the air had become thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. The figure was still shifting, flickering like an illusion. But it wasn't an illusion. It was real. And it was getting closer. Daniel, the voice whispered, this time a low growl that rattled the bones in his body. He froze. The voice was different now. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a growl. A deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the walls. Daniel turned, his back to the door now, eyes darting around the room. There had to be something. A way out. Anything. The room was empty, except for the dark shape. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he was seeing. Was he hallucinating? Was he losing his mind from the isolation? But no, something was here. It wasn't his imagination. The room was alive with an energy that felt wrong. The shadow, the thing in front of him, was alive. And it was waiting. Who are you? Daniel managed to force out, his voice trembling. It was all he could do to keep from screaming. A twisted, mocking laugh echoed in the room, coming from everywhere at once. The laugh was low, almost cruel, and it seemed to reverberate in his skull, making his head spin. You shouldn't have come here, the shadow hissed. You shouldn't have opened the door. Daniel felt his knees buckle beneath him as the words hit him like a physical blow. His mind raced for answers, but none came. His hands trembled as he reached for the walls, searching for something, anything to break the suffocating atmosphere of the room. The temperature dropped even further, his breath now visible in the air, drifting like smoke in front of him. The shadow shifted again, this time moving closer, its form solidifying into something grotesque, its face a twisted amalgamation of nightmare, its eyes glowing a deep red that seemed to pierce the darkness. It was like looking into the abyss itself, something ancient and malevolent that had been waiting here far longer than the building ever had. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart racing, his mind screaming for him to leave. But the more he struggled, the more the shadow seemed to tighten its grip on him, drawing him in. I just wanted to finish my job. I didn't mean to, he stammered, his voice choking as fear flooded his veins. You were never meant to be here, the shadow interrupted, its voice cold and emotionless. This building isn't just a place. It's a trap. A prison for the forgotten. And now, you're one of us. The words sent a cold shiver down Daniel's spine. A prison? For the forgotten. His mind raced, trying to understand. What did it mean? What had he walked into? He had heard the rumors, the whispered tales about the building, but none of them had ever been this real. This close. The shadow's eyes glowed brighter, and it began to move in on him, slowly, deliberately. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the beat echoing in his ears as he realized, there was no way out. Every attempt to open the door was futile. The handle was frozen, as if the room itself was blocking him from leaving. His entire body trembled, the weight of the room pressing down on him with an intensity that made him feel like he was suffocating. He tried to scream again, but no sound came from his mouth. He was trapped. The door, the building, the shadow, it was all closing in on him. He was becoming a part of this nightmare, just another lost soul in a building that never let anyone leave. The shadow drew closer, its shape now forming into a figure, a tall, skeletal figure with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into his very soul. Its mouth opened wide, stretching impossibly far, as it began to speak. You will stay here. Like all the others. Forever. Daniel's body went numb. The words hung in the air like poison, slowly creeping into his mind, suffocating any hope he had left. The darkness pressed in from all sides, as if the room itself was alive, its walls closing in on him, suffocating him with fear. He fought to hold on to his sanity, but it was slipping away, piece by piece. He was losing control of his body, of his mind. The room seemed to distort around him, bending and warping as the shadow loomed closer. Just as he thought he could take no more, the shadow reached out, its hand a cold, skeletal claw that seemed to stretch impossibly long. It brushed against his arm, sending an electric jolt of terror through his entire body. His heart stopped as he felt the cold, icy grip of the shadow, pulling him into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the shadow was gone. The room fell silent. The air grew still again, and for a moment, Daniel dared to believe he had imagined it all. But he hadn't. The door was still closed. The room still dark. The shadow still lurking, waiting for the next soul to stumble into its grasp. Daniel couldn't remember when he had fallen asleep. One moment, he was on the cold floor, his mind racing, fear coursing through his veins. The next, he found himself waking up to the oppressive silence of the room. It was no longer the same as before. The air had thickened, and a suffocating stillness filled every inch of the room, like the building itself had held its breath. His eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and he felt the familiar cold seep into his skin, but something had changed. The room was alive. The shadows were deeper now, more pronounced, and they seemed to twitch, like they were aware of his every movement. He couldn't tell if they were real, but the weight of them was undeniable. Daniel sat up, his chest tight, the eerie silence pressing on his ears, drowning out any thoughts of escape. He could still feel the presence of something that had been watching him, waiting for him to stir. His eyes darted around the room. The door, still locked, stood motionless. The walls loomed, closer now, as though they were pressing in, slowly, quietly, methodically. There was something unsettling about the way the room felt, like a trap closing in around him, suffocating any hope of freedom. He tried to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. The floor felt colder than before, his feet numb as they met the chill. His breath came in shallow bursts, a cold fog forming with each exhale. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse quickening, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Not yet. Something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a faint scrape of something against the floor, so quiet it could have been his imagination. But it wasn't. He could hear it again, this time louder, closer, as though someone, or something, was dragging itself across the room. His body tensed, and every hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned, eyes wide with fear. But the room was empty. Nothing. Just the shadows, stretching in the corners like dark fingers reaching for him. His heart raced faster, his breath becoming shallow and panicked. He had to get out, had to find a way to escape this nightmare. He rushed to the door again, his hand trembling as he gripped the cold handle. He twisted it, nothing. The door remained sealed, as if mocking him. His thoughts were clouded with panic, and then the sound came again. It was louder now. Dragging. Scraping. But this time, it was behind him. He froze. Slowly, he turned. There, in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim light, was a figure. Its silhouette was tall, thin, almost skeletal. It was watching him, motionless. Its eyes were wide open, black as coal, and they gleamed in the darkness, like twin orbs of pure malice. A figure so still, so silent, it could have been mistaken for a statue. But Daniel knew better. He could feel the presence, the weight of its stare. It wasn't a statue. It was waiting. The creature's skin was pale, sickly, and its face was stretched in a grotesque expression, as though it had once been human but was now something else. Its mouth hung open, twisted, but it didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stared at him, unmoving, with those hollow, empty eyes. Daniel felt a chill creep into his bones. It was as if the room had grown colder, the air heavier. Every breath he took seemed to fill his lungs with ice. His body screamed at him to run, to escape, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The figure, no, whatever it was so still, so silent, that it didn't even seem to breathe. It was as if it had always been there, watching him from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then it moved. The figure's head tilted to the side, its neck cracking like brittle bone. A soft, slow creak that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. The creature's eyes never left him, even as its head tilted further, and for a moment, Daniel could swear he saw a smile form on the thing's lips, though it was twisted, unnatural, like it was amused by his fear. The smile didn't belong to something human. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if his feet were frozen to the ground, his body paralyzed in place by some unseen force. The creature didn't approach. It just stayed there, its eyes locked onto Daniel's, its smile stretching wider. Then, as if it had grown tired of waiting, it began to move toward him. Slowly. Deliberately. Each step it took was unnervingly silent, but Daniel could feel its presence drawing closer with every passing moment. His pulse raced in his ears, and his breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat like a drum of impending doom. He could feel the weight of the thing's eyes on him, its presence suffocating. It stopped a few feet away from him, its hollow eyes never blinking. Daniel's hands shook as he tried to reach for the door again, but it was no use. The door was still locked, still mocking him. The creature was inches away now, and Daniel could smell the rancid stench of decay filling the air. It was overwhelming, sickly sweet and vile. His stomach churned as he fought the urge to gag. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything human. And then, it spoke. Its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was a hiss, a whisper that scraped against Daniel's mind like nails on a chalkboard. He could feel the words reverberate in his skull. You can't escape. Daniel's heart skipped a beat, the words crashing over him like a tidal wave of fear. His knees buckled beneath him, but he caught himself on the cold stone floor. His mind spun, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. The air was thick with terror, choking him, suffocating him. The creature took a step closer. And then another. It reached out, its skeletal fingers brushing against Daniel's shoulder, sending an electric jolt of terror through his body. It was ice cold, like death itself. He flinched, but it didn't release its grip. The thing's breath, putrid and foul, washed over him as its cold hand clenched tighter. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice curling around him like a snake. Forever. In that moment, Daniel realized something that shook him to his core. The creature didn't want to kill him. No. It wanted something far worse. It wanted to trap him here, in this room, in this building. To make him one of them. And there was no way out. Daniel could barely breathe. The room had shrunk around him, the air thickening, making every breath feel like an impossible task. The creature's fingers were still wrapped around his shoulder, its grip unyielding, colder than the deepest night. He tried to move, to break free, but his body refused to obey. His legs were like lead, frozen in place, as if the very room itself was holding him captive. The creature loomed over him, its breath fetid and close, filling his senses with something rotten, decayed. It didn't speak anymore, but Daniel could feel it, that dreadful presence, suffocating him. Its fingers dug deeper into his skin, and his vision blurred, the edges of his sight darkening as if the room was swallowing him whole. Every time he blinked, he could swear the walls were inching closer, the shadows pressing in, suffocating him. For what seemed like an eternity, they stayed like that, Daniel trapped in place, the thing's presence hovering over him. The silence was deafening, and all Daniel could hear was the erratic pounding of his heart. His thoughts raced. He tried to make sense of the nightmare he was trapped in, but there was nothing that made sense here. Not the building, not the shadows, and certainly not the creature that stood before him. It wasn't real, was it? But it was. And it was closing in. The grip on his shoulder tightened, and then, with a suddenness that left Daniel gasping for air, the creature yanked him up off the floor. It was too fast, too strong. He was dragged to his feet, his head spinning from the motion, and as the creature pulled him closer, Daniel could feel the icy cold of its touch seeping into his very bones. His breath came out in short, panicked gasps. "Why?" Daniel managed to croak, his voice hoarse with fear. His throat burned from the terror that gripped him, his words barely above a whisper. The creature did not answer. Instead, it let out a low, raspy laugh, a sound that scraped against Daniel's sanity, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The laughter wasn't human. It was something darker, ancient, as though it had come from the very depths of the earth. It was mocking him. Daniel's pulse raced, his chest constricting. There was no escape, no one coming to help. The room felt like a prison, the walls closing in tighter, suffocating him. He could feel the coldness of the creature's grip spread to his very soul, as if it was draining the warmth from his body, leaving him hollow. The creature's head tilted again, that disturbing crack of its neck filling the silence. It didn't blink, didn't look away. Its black eyes bored into Daniel's, gleaming with a strange, malicious intelligence. It didn't speak, but Daniel felt the weight of its stare, a gaze that seemed to pierce through him, seeing into the deepest corners of his mind. "Why are you doing this?" Daniel's voice was shaky, almost inaudible. But the creature didn't answer. Instead, it began to drag him across the room. Its movements were deliberate, slow, almost like it was savoring the moment. The walls seemed to shift as it pulled him forward, their darkened corners growing deeper, more sinister, as if they were alive. Daniel's heart raced as he tried to push against the pull, his body fighting instinctively, but it was no use. The grip was unrelenting, as though the creature had all the time in the world to torment him. The silence enveloped them, thick and suffocating, until he could no longer tell if the building itself was alive or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. With each step, Daniel felt himself growing weaker, his limbs more like jelly, his mind fogged with fear. He could see it now, the door. The one door in the corner of the room. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light escaping from the cracks. A possibility, a hope, or so he thought. The creature had led him straight toward it. But just as he neared it, the door slammed shut, the sound like a thunderclap in his ears. No. Daniel gasped, his eyes wide in horror. Please. I need to get out. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it tightened its grip on him and pulled him back from the door. The room seemed to tilt, and the shadows danced around them, swirling like dark smoke. The light from the cracks in the door flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. Daniel's heart pounded. Panic surged through him, and he began to thrash against the creature's hold, but it was like fighting against the tide. No matter how hard he tried, it was futile. The thing was too strong. Suddenly, the floor beneath him shifted. He stumbled, almost losing his footing, and then it happened. The walls groaned, a terrible sound that sent a wave of dread through his chest. The building itself seemed to be alive, shifting, bending, as though it was breathing. And then, from the corner of his eye, Daniel saw something, movement, a shadow, a fleeting shape in the darkness. It was a figure, but it was no longer just the creature. There were more. Shapes, shadows, figures, countless eyes watching from the dark corners of the room. The air became heavy, thick with something unnameable. The room felt alive, the walls pulsating, the shadows swirling around him like a living thing. The whispers began again, faint at first, growing louder with each passing second. He could hear them now, all around him. The voices of the lost souls trapped within the building, their whispers like a chorus of madness, mingling with the creature's laugh. "You're never leaving," a voice rasped, so faint it seemed to come from the very walls. "None of you are." Daniel's blood ran cold. His breath hitched, his mind whirling as the realization sank in. He wasn't the first to be trapped here. The building had consumed others before him, and it would consume him too, just like it had done to all the others. There was no escape. No way out. The room closed in tighter, the shadows creeping in like claws, and Daniel's knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor, his mind spinning, the whispers growing louder. The creature loomed above him, silent once more, its eyes fixed on him, its grip like iron around his soul. And then, in the silence, a single word echoed through the room, louder than any scream. "Forever." Daniel's eyes snapped open, but the darkness around him was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. His head throbbed as he tried to move, but his body felt like it was made of lead, pinned to the cold ground. The echo of his pulse was the only sound he could hear, the silence around him overwhelming. He tried to lift his arms, but the weight of the air, thick, dense, and oppressively cold, held him in place. His breath came out in short, panicked bursts, and his heart raced. The world felt like it was spinning, but everything was black, absolute, impenetrable black. Was it over? Was the creature gone? Was he safe? No. The thought barely had time to form before a low groan rumbled through the ground beneath him. It was deep, unnatural. The air seemed to vibrate with it. Daniel's body froze as the sound echoed all around him, coming from the very walls, the floor, and the ceiling, as if the entire building was alive, groaning in pain. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was spinning, tangled in confusion and terror. Something was wrong. So wrong. And then, something shifted in the air, like a pressure building, just before a storm. His instincts screamed at him to get up, to run, but his limbs remained locked in place. Every muscle screamed with the effort of moving, but it felt as if he were trapped, his body caught in an invisible web. The building was alive, and it was aware of him, watching him. waiting. The sudden sound of dragging footsteps caught his attention, sharp and eerie, reverberating through the thick air. He tried to locate the source, but his mind was clouded. There was no one else in the room, or so it seemed. The noise continued, slow, methodical, as though it was drawing closer, each step a reminder of the horrors that had already taken place in this wretched place. But no. There was something else now, something darker, something more sinister. The shadows on the walls began to twist in unnatural patterns, stretching and undulating as if they were alive. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The walls, once solid, now seemed to bend and shift like liquid. They reached out, stretching their dark, tendril-like fingers towards him. He fought against the invisible force holding him in place, trying to free himself, but it was as if the shadows themselves were binding him, suffocating him in their grip. A voice. A whisper. So faint at first, Daniel wasn't sure it was real. But then it came again, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "Help me." The words were weak, desperate, like a cry for salvation from somewhere deep within the building. But there was no escape. The building, this cursed place, was not just a structure. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that fed off the souls that dared to enter. Daniel was not the first to fall victim to it, and he would not be the last. Another whisper. Louder this time, more urgent. "Leave, or become like us." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His pulse hammered in his ears, and his throat tightened with panic. The voice, it sounded familiar. It sounded like someone he knew. But he couldn't remember who. His mind was a jumble of confusion, the shadows closing in on him, pulling him deeper into the building's web. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the shadows began to coalesce. The walls were no longer just shifting, they were folding in on themselves, collapsing toward the center of the room, like the building itself was drawing him in. He could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping at an alarming rate, as if the very life was being sucked out of the room. The sound of the dragging footsteps grew louder, closer. Daniel tried to move, but the shadows had already wrapped around his arms and legs, pulling him down. He screamed, the sound choked and desperate, but no one could hear him. The building, the shadows, they were the only things left in the world. And they were coming for him. A figure materialized from the shadows, tall, skeletal, its form barely human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, stretching as it moved, its body bent at odd angles. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as it crept toward him, its face hidden in the folds of the darkness. And then it spoke. Its voice was like nails on a chalkboard, scraping across the fragile thread of his sanity. "Did you think you could escape? You're here to stay now." Daniel's heart nearly stopped in his chest. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold and fetid against his skin, and Daniel could feel its malevolent gaze even though it had no eyes. "You will never leave this place." The figure reached out toward him, and Daniel's body convulsed in terror. The shadows, thick and oppressive, reached for him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. His vision blurred, and the edges of his mind began to fray as the figure loomed over him, its form shifting, becoming more monstrous with every passing second. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. And there was no escaping it. Daniel's body felt like it was being pulled apart from the inside out. Every muscle, every nerve, screamed in agony as he lay crumpled on the cold, unforgiving floor. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, and his thoughts were clouded, disjointed, but one thing was clear: he had no control anymore. The creature still hovered above him, its dark eyes fixed on his every movement, its cold presence suffocating him like a vice. The air in the room was heavier now, saturated with something unholy. It felt as though the very essence of the building itself was alive, pulsating, feeding off his fear. He tried to move, but it was as if the very weight of the room pressed down on him, binding him in place. His limbs felt numb, his body sluggish, and his mind raced with an endless torrent of questions. What was happening? Why was this happening? He could feel the walls creeping closer, closing in on him, and he could hear the whispers again, those maddening voices that seemed to come from everywhere, as if they were seeping out of the walls themselves. "Get up," one of the whispers urged, barely audible, but distinct. "You can't stay here. It's coming." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He tried to turn his head, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as though the darkness itself was crawling under his skin, wrapping around his insides, rooting him to the spot. The creature leaned in closer, its breath now a low growl that rumbled in the pit of his stomach. He could feel the sharp, rancid scent of death on its breath, and his stomach churned in response. It spoke again, its voice a rasping whisper. "You thought you could leave, but no one leaves." The words echoed in Daniel's mind, and for a moment, he felt a wave of terror unlike anything he had ever known. The building, the creature, none of it made sense. But he understood now, with terrifying clarity, there was no escape. It wasn't just a nightmare. This was real. The walls, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of something far older, far more malevolent than anything he could have imagined. The creature's fingers twitched, and suddenly, the room shifted. The walls groaned, the floor beneath him trembled, and for a split second, Daniel felt a surge of dread unlike anything he had ever felt before. The shadows, once still, now began to twist and writhe as though they had a mind of their own. They slithered along the floor, the ceiling, creeping along the edges of the room. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until it felt as though 1,000 voices were screaming in his ears. "Run! Don't stay! Help!" Each whisper was a shard of glass, cutting into his thoughts, driving him mad. He could hear them now, those trapped souls, their voices distant, muffled, but filled with desperation. They were trying to warn him, trying to tell him something, but what? And then, in the deepest corner of his mind, a realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't alone. The creature might have been the one tormenting him, but it wasn't the only thing in this building. The whispers, they were coming from something else. Something older. Something far more dangerous. The shadows shifted again, and this time, Daniel saw it. A shape, a silhouette standing in the far corner of the room, watching him. At first, he thought it was just another trick of the light, another figment of his fear-stricken mind. But no. This figure, this presence, it was different. It was taller, much taller than the creature, and it seemed to absorb the light, its form barely visible, a blur of blackness that seemed to ripple with the darkness itself. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he tried to focus on it, but his vision was growing hazy, his mind slipping further away from him. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, deep, almost a hum. It wasn't the creature. No. This was something else. It wasn't speaking to Daniel directly, but its words reverberated in his skull, as though it were speaking inside his mind. "You're here because you have nowhere else to be." Daniel's heart slammed in his chest. The words, the tone, they were colder than the air around him, colder than the creature's touch. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was still frozen in place, his limbs refusing to obey. The figure in the corner stepped forward, and as it did, the shadows parted like a curtain. The thing moved with an unsettling grace, its form flowing like liquid darkness, its presence so oppressive that Daniel could feel it pressing in on him from all sides. He could barely breathe, his lungs constricting as the air grew thicker, heavier. And then, as the figure drew closer, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. It had no face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, featureless surface where its face should have been. It was like looking at a mirror that reflected nothing. A void. Daniel's mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to respond. The creature had released its grip on him, but now he was completely at the mercy of whatever this new entity was. The shadows continued to twist and writhe around him, and the whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. "Help me! I'm sorry. Please, don't let it take me. Daniel felt his sanity slipping away as the figure loomed closer. It wasn't just in the room anymore, it was in his mind. He could feel it, its influence creeping into every corner of his thoughts, filling him with terror, despair, hopelessness. It was close now, so close he could feel the chill emanating from its faceless void, a coldness that threatened to consume him whole. His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He had to move. He had to escape. But how? As if reading his thoughts, the faceless figure let out a sound that was neither a laugh nor a growl. It was something worse, a sound that resonated deep within Daniel's very soul. The walls shuddered, and the whispers grew louder still, drowning out everything else. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice like a dagger in Daniel's mind. You are already here. The floor beneath him gave way, the very foundation of the building cracking, and Daniel plummeted into the darkness. Daniel could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in the suffocating silence that surrounded him. His limbs trembled, not just from fear but from the cold that now gnawed at him from the inside out. The figure, the thing from the shadows, was closer now, its cold breath brushing his skin as it hovered over him. It whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't distant. It was right beside his ear, so close that Daniel could feel the air shift with every word. Do you know what happens to those who stay here? What happens to those who fail to escape? Daniel's throat constricted, and he could barely manage to speak. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, as if savoring his terror. Its long, skeletal fingers reached out, scraping along the floor, dragging against the walls, sending a shiver down Daniel's spine. You are not the first to walk these halls, it said finally, its voice a hollow, rasping sound that reverberated in his mind. Nor will you be the last. The building does not let go of its visitors. It takes, it consumes, and it leaves nothing behind. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just a haunted building, it was alive, a parasite feeding off the souls of anyone who dared to enter. The real horror was that it wasn't just the building, it was the people trapped inside. The people who became a part of it. The people who vanished, never to be heard from again. Please, Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. I can't stay here. I won't. A cold, cruel laugh filled the room, cutting off his plea. It's too late for that. The building has already claimed you. Daniel's breath came faster now, his chest tightening with panic. He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape. But no matter how much he struggled, no matter how hard he tried to move, the shadows held him in place. The walls seemed to close in on him, and he could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against him, suffocating him. The figure moved closer, its skeletal face now just inches from his. Daniel could see it clearly now, its skin was stretched tight over its bones, its eyes hollow, black pits that seemed to devour all light. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. You are not leaving. Not now. Not ever. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears as the figure's hand reached out, cold and clammy, grabbing him by the wrist. The touch sent a shock of ice through his body, and he felt the last remnants of his strength drain away. The building's influence, its grip on him, was growing stronger, and he could feel it pulling him into its very core. The ground beneath him began to shift, sinking, warping, as if the building itself was alive, reshaping itself to consume him whole. The walls twisted and contorted, stretching impossibly high and wide, their edges blurring, like the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. Daniel could feel himself being dragged down, deeper, as the shadows twisted around him like tendrils. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. It was pointless. Nothing mattered. He was being consumed, body, mind, and soul, by the very building that had trapped him. In that moment, Daniel realized the truth. He wasn't just trapped inside this building. He was becoming part of it. His limbs grew cold, numb, as though the life was being drained from him. His vision blurred, and the world around him started to fade, slipping into the inky void of nothingness. His body no longer obeyed him, his will fading, consumed by the pull of the shadows. And then, all at once, it was gone. The figure, the building, the shadows, they all vanished. But Daniel didn't feel the relief of escape. Instead, he was aware of only one thing, the deafening silence. It was as if he had been ripped from the world entirely. He couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't feel. His existence had become a faint echo, a whisper in the void. Suddenly, he could hear it. The faintest whisper, distant but familiar, growing louder and louder until it consumed all other sounds. "Welcome home." The voice was familiar, too familiar. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mind screamed in terror as he realized who the voice belonged to. It was his own voice. And as the last remnants of his consciousness slipped away, he understood the true horror of it all. There was no escape. The building didn't just claim you, it made you part of it. Forever. The voices inside the walls, the whispers in the dark, they were all part of it. And now, he was just another lost soul, another whisper in the endless, suffocating darkness. The building had claimed him. And there was no leaving. It was a night like any other, until Henry received the call. His brother, Watson, had gone missing. But it wasn't the usual disappearance. No, this time, something felt off. The local police found nothing, but whispers started circling. People in town were starting to vanish. And the worst part? The only clue they found was a strange symbol etched into the trees near an old abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town. But there's something else, something far darker. Will Henry find his brother before it's too late? Or will he become the next name whispered in fear? Keep watching, because what happens next will shake you to the core. The wind outside howled through the narrow alleyways, rattling the windows of Henry's apartment. It was the kind of night where the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, filling every crevice with an oppressive, choking silence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but his thoughts weren't on work. Something had been off lately, like the universe had shifted just slightly, enough to make him feel uneasy. Henry had always been the careful one. The logical one. His brother Watson, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of impulsive decisions, daring adventures, and a complete disregard for the consequences. They'd grown up like night and day. But tonight, something about Watson's absence felt different. The phone call Henry had received earlier that evening still echoed in his mind. It was strange, distant, fragmented, like something wasn't quite right. "Henry, you've got to come," Watson's voice had been panicked, rushed. "I don't know how to explain it, but something is wrong." The line had gone dead before Henry could respond. A soft beep. No goodbye, no explanation. It wasn't unusual for Watson to get into trouble. In fact, Henry had grown used to his brother's wild antics. But this time it felt like it was more than just a reckless stunt. There was a coldness in Watson's voice that sent a chill down Henry's spine. Something was lurking in the air, something Henry couldn't quite put his finger on. He stood up from the desk, a sense of urgency flooding his veins. Watson had been staying in a small cabin in the woods outside of town. It was a place he often retreated to when he needed solitude. Henry had always found the place strange, a rundown shack surrounded by dense trees, far from the safety of civilization. But Watson swore there was something peaceful about it, something that kept him coming back despite the eerie feeling it gave off. Henry had always chalked it up to his brother's wild imagination, but now, in the dead of night, he wasn't so sure. The phone rang again, and Henry's heart skipped a beat. "Henry, where are you?" It was his mother's voice, shaky, tense. "I tried calling Watson's phone, but it's off." "I don't understand." He was supposed to come back hours ago. A lump formed in Henry's throat. His mother's fear was palpable, and for the first time, he felt it too. "I'm going to find him, Mom." "Don't worry," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. What if something had happened to Watson? What if this wasn't just another one of his stunts, but something far worse? He grabbed his jacket, the cold fabric offering little comfort as he stepped outside. The air was thick with mist, the moon hidden behind a blanket of clouds. He wasn't far from Watson's cabin, just a short drive through the winding road that led deep into the woods. As Henry turned the ignition, the engine sputtered for a moment before roaring to life. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew he had to go. His brother was out there, somewhere. As he drove through the deserted streets, the trees lining the road seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further he went, the more oppressive the silence became. The kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. Henry shook off the thought. He wasn't one to give in to paranoia. But something about this place, about tonight, felt wrong. He finally arrived at the cabin, or what was left of it. The once quaint wooden structure was now dilapidated, with broken windows and overgrown weeds encroaching on the porch. There was a single light on inside, casting an eerie glow through the dirty glass. Henry stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. Watson had been here before, many times. This was supposed to be a place of safety. Yet, tonight, it felt like anything but. He approached the door, which was slightly ajar, the hinges creaking in protest as he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark, save for the flickering light in the corner. A faint, acrid smell hung in the air, something musty, decayed. Henry's stomach turned as he stepped further inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. "Watson," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty cabin. There was no answer. He walked deeper into the living room, his flashlight scanning the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes flicked from corner to corner, searching for any sign of his brother. But the cabin was eerily still. Too still. That's when he saw it. A symbol, carved into the wooden floor, just beyond the worn-out rug. It wasn't a random mark, it looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. A circle with strange markings inside. Henry bent down to examine it, his breath hitching. He had no idea what it meant, but he knew one thing for sure: Watson had been here recently. The fresh wood shavings around the edges were still visible. But why hadn't Watson mentioned this before? Why hadn't he told anyone about the symbol? His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. "Henry," his mother's voice cracked through the receiver. "You need to get out of there. Please. You're not safe. I don't know how to explain it, but something's wrong. The police, they found something. A body. Near the old cabin." Henry's blood ran cold. The words felt like they didn't belong in his mind. Body? It couldn't be. He backed away from the symbol, panic rising in his chest. He had to find Watson. But as he reached for the door to leave, a voice, soft, distorted, whispered his name from behind him. "Henry." He froze, his entire body tense with fear. "Watson." His voice trembled as he turned toward the source of the sound. But the cabin was empty. And yet, the voice had been real. He wasn't alone. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as the whisper of his brother's name echoed in the air. He spun around, but the cabin was still empty. The flickering light in the corner seemed to cast longer shadows, twisting and stretching as if it were alive, breathing in the darkness. "Watson." His voice cracked as he called out again, his mind racing with confusion and fear. He took a cautious step toward the back of the cabin, where the strange symbol had been etched into the floorboards. But as he moved, the floor creaked beneath his feet, louder than it should have been. The silence that followed was suffocating, making every sound feel amplified. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but inside, it was deathly still. Too still. Henry's flashlight beam trembled as it scanned the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run back to his car and drive as far as possible. But he couldn't. Not yet. He needed answers. He needed to find Watson. He turned his attention to the walls, his flashlight now sweeping across the cabin, illuminating the remnants of old furniture, chairs with peeling upholstery, a dusty coffee table, and cobwebs hanging from the rafters. But something caught his eye. The wall opposite him wasn't like the others. It was covered in strange markings, almost like graffiti but far older, as if it had been there for decades. Henry stepped closer, his flashlight dancing over the symbols. They were different from the one on the floor, more chaotic, lines overlapping, circles intertwined, and jagged shapes that didn't make any sense. But there was one symbol that stood out among the rest, almost as if it were carved more deeply into the wood. It resembled an eye. Or maybe it was meant to look like one. It seemed to follow him as he moved across the room, his mind trying to make sense of it. The air grew colder as Henry examined the symbol, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. His gut twisted with dread, the feeling of being watched intensifying. He could feel it now, something was wrong, something beyond his comprehension. But what was it? He turned his back on the wall and returned to the strange symbol on the floor. His eyes scanned the surrounding area, hoping for some sort of clue, some hint as to what had happened to Watson. But as his gaze moved across the room, his flashlight landed on something that sent his heart into a frantic race. A figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shadow against the far wall. But as his flashlight beam hit it directly, it wasn't a person. It was a shape, dark, shifting, almost unnatural. The figure moved with a fluidity that didn't belong to the human form. Henry froze, the beam of light trembling in his hand. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it Watson? No, it couldn't be. The figure didn't look like him at all. It was tall, almost impossibly so, with elongated limbs that stretched unnaturally. And then, the figure turned its head slowly toward him, and Henry felt his breath catch in his throat. Its face, it was distorted, like a mask that had been melted and reformed. There were no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to devour the light, and its mouth was stretched open far wider than any humans could ever be, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. Henry. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't Watson's. It was distorted, like something trying to speak through a broken speaker. Without thinking, Henry took a step back, his legs trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It simply stared at him with those dark, empty eye sockets. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next, it was gone. The room was silent again. Too silent. Henry's pulse thundered in his ears as he stood frozen in place. His mind was racing. Had he imagined it? Was it some sort of hallucination brought on by the isolation, the fear, the night itself? But deep down, he knew it hadn't been his imagination. He had seen it. He had felt it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. And it was here. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The coldness in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, pressing in from all sides. The air felt thick, as if something was suffocating him, strangling him slowly. He couldn't stay here. He needed to leave, to get out before whatever it was could make its move. But as he turned toward the door, he stopped dead in his tracks. The door was no longer ajar. It was closed. Completely shut. Henry's heart raced. He hadn't closed it. He knew he hadn't. And that's when he heard it. A faint tapping sound, like fingers tapping on wood. Slowly, rhythmically, from behind the door. Tap. 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 It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too human. Without thinking, Henry rushed toward the door and grabbed the handle, pulling with all his strength. But it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. "Watson!" He called again, his voice shaking with panic. "Is that you? What's happening?" No answer. Only the tapping. The sound was growing louder now. Closer. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. A deafening silence filled the cabin, and for a moment, Henry felt like he might lose his mind. What was going on? What kind of place had Watson brought him to? The flashlight in his hand flickered once more, and when it came back on, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the cabin, the symbol on the floor had changed. The lines had shifted, rearranged, and now, where there had been only one eye, there were three. And they were watching him. The tapping began again. Louder, more frantic. And then, from somewhere deep within the cabin, a low, guttural growl echoed through the walls. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. Henry's hands trembled as he reached for the door handle again. This time, it opened. But he didn't hesitate. He ran. As he stumbled outside, the moonlight hit him, and for a moment, he thought he might be safe. But when he turned back to look at the cabin, the window on the second floor was dark. Empty. Then, he saw it. A shadow standing in the window, watching him. And for the first time, Henry understood the true meaning of terror. Something was waiting for him in that cabin. And it was not about to let him leave. Henry's breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled away from the cabin, his eyes flicking nervously over his shoulder. Every step felt like a lifetime, the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching out for him. His mind raced. What had he seen in that cabin? The figure with the grotesque face, the shifting symbols, the tapping, it had all been too real, too tangible to ignore. But what terrified him more than anything was the feeling, the deep, gnawing certainty that whatever he had witnessed wasn't just a product of his imagination. It was something far worse. Something alive. And now, as he sprinted through the forest, the growls, the tapping, the eyes, all of it echoed in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He needed to get back to the car. He needed to get out of here. But every time he thought he had distanced himself from the cabin, the darkness seemed to pull him back. His head swam, dizziness taking hold, and he felt like the forest itself was conspiring against him. He shook his head violently, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't think straight. All he could do was run as fast as he could, praying that he would reach the clearing where his car was parked. But then, he heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, then growing louder. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he stopped dead in his tracks. His heart began to hammer against his ribcage, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. He turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Nothing. The forest was silent once again, too quiet. Henry let out a slow breath, trying to calm himself. It was probably just an animal, a deer or something. He forced himself to keep moving, but his steps were slower now, more cautious. Then, the sound came again. But this time, it was closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. He froze. His pulse quickened. Someone, or something, was following him. He looked over his shoulder once again, but the darkness was too thick to make out any shapes. The path behind him was swallowed up by the trees, but the sound of footsteps was unmistakable. It was growing closer, the rhythmic pounding of something moving quickly through the underbrush. Henry broke into a sprint again, fear rising in his chest like a tidal wave. He wasn't alone. Something was behind him, chasing him, closing the gap with every stride. His breath came in ragged bursts, his legs burning with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The trees seemed to blur past him, but still, the footsteps followed. They were right behind him, as if something were gaining on him with every passing moment. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from somewhere in the woods, like a tree branch breaking. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He stumbled, falling to the ground with a crash. The flashlight flew from his hand, skittering across the dirt. For a moment, everything was still. The footsteps stopped. Henry's chest heaved as he pushed himself up, scrambling to find the flashlight. His fingers brushed against the cold earth, his pulse pounding in his ears. His hand closed around the flashlight just as he heard the rustling again, closer this time, like something was moving through the leaves right next to him. Without thinking, Henry jumped to his feet, his flashlight beam flickering erratically as he swung it in all directions. There was nothing. Just the dark, oppressive silence of the forest. His breath was ragged, his body drenched in sweat, and his legs wobbled beneath him. He was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. The footsteps had been real, hadn't they? They couldn't have been imagined. They were there. They had been right behind him. But now, nothing. No sign of any person or creature. He stood there, listening to the silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But then, the growl came again. Low. Guttural. From behind him. Henry spun around, his flashlight landing on nothing but trees and shadows. His heart stopped. The growl wasn't just a sound. It was coming from something. Something alive. And whatever it was very, very close. Then, as if to confirm his worst fear, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. At first, it was just one. But then, 2 more joined it. And then 3 more. Dozens of them. All eyes, yellow and hungry, floating in the dark like fireflies, watching him, unblinking, unmoving. Henry's breath hitched. He wanted to run. But he couldn't move. It was like the eyes were pulling him in, drawing him closer to something that he couldn't comprehend. His chest tightened, and the growl grew louder, more desperate. The eyes were shifting now, blinking rapidly, and someone, was moving between them. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something he could identify. But it was coming for him. Before he could react, something grabbed him from behind, cold, clammy fingers wrapped around his wrist, yanking him backward. Henry. The voice was distorted, low and guttural. Not Watson's. Not anyone's he recognized. Henry screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip tightened, pulling him toward the dark presence that stood just beyond the glow of the eyes. The growl became deafening now, an awful sound that raked through his bones. And just as Henry's flashlight flickered one last time and died, leaving him in complete darkness, the last thing he saw was the shadow of a figure looming over him. Tall. Elongated. His skin crawled as it bent down to whisper in his ear. You shouldn't have come. Then, everything went black. The cold had seeped into Henry's bones. His mind was a haze, and his body felt as though it had been torn apart, but somehow, he still clung to consciousness. The darkness had swallowed him whole. He couldn't remember how long he had been unconscious, but now he was awake, and something was terribly wrong. He slowly opened his eyes, but the world around him remained in impenetrable blackness. His breath was shallow, and his chest felt tight, as if something was crushing him from all sides. The air was thick with an unspoken weight, and the silence was so absolute, it felt unnatural. Henry's hands shot out instinctively, searching for something to anchor him, but there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, hard ground beneath him. No trees. No leaves. No rustling sounds of the forest. It was as though the very earth had disappeared, leaving only the darkness. Where am I? The question slipped from his lips, barely a whisper. His voice sounded foreign to him, like it didn't belong in this place. It echoed, bouncing off nothing, as if there were no walls to confine the sound. Panic rose in his chest. He tried to push himself up, but the sensation was strange. His limbs didn't respond the way they should. They were sluggish, like he was moving underwater. He forced his body upright, but as he did, a cold draft washed over him, brushing his skin like 1,000 invisible fingers. Henry froze, eyes wide with fear, listening intently. Then he heard it. The whisper. It was so faint at first that he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then it came again, closer this time, almost as if it was circling him, creeping just beyond his reach. A voice, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Henry. Henry. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and his heart pounded in his chest. He whipped his head around, desperately searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. No person. No figure. Just the oppressive void of darkness surrounding him on all sides. "Who's there?" Henry demanded, his voice shaking. But the only reply he got was the same haunting whisper. "Henry." His breath hitched. It was the same voice. He would have sworn on his life it was. "Watson." He called out, his voice cracking. "Stive. Is that you?" A low, guttural laugh answered him instead, making his blood run cold. The laugh seemed to echo around him, warping and distorting as though it came from multiple voices all at once. Henry's heart skipped a beat, and the chill that ran down his spine was more than just physical. It was as if the very atmosphere around him had shifted, turned cold, hostile, alive. "Who's there?" Henry shouted now, panic creeping into his voice. "What do you want?" The whispering stopped. The laugh died out. For a moment, the silence was almost worse than the whispers had been. Henry stood there, trembling in the dark, the world around him pressing in. His mind was racing. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way back to the real world, wherever that was. Then, just as his thoughts began to spiral, a faint light appeared ahead of him. It wasn't much, just a flicker, like the glow of a distant firefly. But it was enough. He squinted, trying to make out what it was. The light pulsed, growing brighter, then dimming again, as if it were trying to communicate something. Henry felt a pull toward it. Something in his gut told him it was a sign, a chance to escape whatever nightmare he was trapped in. He staggered toward it, his legs shaky but determined. Every step felt heavy, as if the darkness was trying to keep him from moving forward. The light flickered again, now brighter, closer, and Henry's heart leaped with hope. He moved faster, pushing his body to its limits, trying to reach it before it disappeared. And then, just as he was about to reach out and touch it, the light went out. Complete darkness. Henry stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. No sound. No movement. He couldn't see anything, not even his own hands in front of his face. His chest heaved as he swallowed back a rising scream. Then, he heard it again, the whisper. "Don't run." It was so close now, so near that he could feel the cold breath against his ear. Henry whipped around, his body trembling with fear, but there was no one there. The whisper was all around him, like the very air was speaking, the voices echoing from every direction. "Who are you?" Henry gasped, his mind teetering on the edge of sanity. "What do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps began to echo in the dark. Each step was measured, heavy, and deliberate, as though the thing, or things, following him were savoring his fear. Henry spun around, his eyes darting, trying to locate the source of the sound. But there was nothing. No one. Just the footsteps, growing louder, closer. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to move. He had to get out of there. His feet found the ground, and he ran, blindly, desperately, feeling the presence behind him, closer with every step. He didn't dare look back. He could hear the breathing now, deep, guttural, unnatural, but he didn't stop. And then, as though some invisible force had snapped, he fell. Hard. The ground beneath him shifted, like a rug pulled out from under him. He tumbled forward, his head slamming against something solid. A sharp pain shot through his skull, and for a moment, everything went white. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the ground. But this time, the silence was unbearable. He lifted his head, groaning in pain, his vision swimming. The whispers were gone. The footsteps had stopped. The darkness remained, but now there was something else. A figure stood before him, just beyond the reach of his vision. It was tall. Too tall. Its shadow stretched unnaturally long, twisting and warping in ways that no human shape should. Henry's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't move. He couldn't scream. And then the figure spoke. "We've been waiting for you." The voice was soft, like a caress, but it was full of malice. It wasn't human. Henry's body tensed, the fear seeping into every muscle, and then the figure took a step forward, and everything went black. Henry's eyes fluttered open, but the world around him remained a dark and oppressive void. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, but his head ached fiercely, and his body felt heavy, as though he had been weighed down by invisible chains. A cold sweat slicked his skin, and his breath came in shallow gasps. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, drowning out all other sounds, but then, there was something. A hum. Low and distant, but growing louder, almost vibrating in the air around him. It wasn't natural, this sound. It was rhythmic, like the pulse of something ancient and unholy. Henry tried to move, but his limbs refused to cooperate. Panic surged through him. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on all sides, suffocating him, yet there was no escape. It was as though the very air itself was made of shadows, closing in on him. "Where am I?" His voice cracked in the silence. It was the only sound he could make, but it felt wrong, hollow. As though the words didn't belong to him. A sudden chill swept through him, and Henry gasped, his breath coming out in a cloud of white vapor, even though there was no sign of cold in the air. Something moved in the darkness. A shape. A shifting shadow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the hum. He strained his eyes, trying to focus, but the darkness was too thick. His mind raced. He had to move. He had to get up. With all his strength, he pushed himself off the ground, his body trembling as he rose to his feet. The world around him seemed to swirl, the edges of his vision growing blurry. He staggered, trying to find his balance, his hands grasping at the empty air for support. But the darkness, whatever it was, seemed to push back, as if it had a mind of its own. Suddenly, the hum grew louder, sharper, until it felt as if it were inside his head, reverberating through his skull. The air thickened, growing heavy, and Henry's lungs burned as he struggled to breathe. He gasped, his heart racing. The shadows around him twisted, folding into themselves, and for a split second, he thought he saw something, someone. A face. Pale, eyes wide with terror, staring back at him from the depths of the darkness. "Who?" Henry's voice faltered, fear crawling up his throat like icy fingers. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move. It was frozen, as if it were waiting for something. Or someone. Henry took a step forward, his body trembling with every movement. He wasn't sure if it was a person, or if it was just a trick of the shadows, but the eyes, those eyes, had seemed so real. So alive. Another step. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, pressing against his chest like invisible hands. The figure remained still, watching him, unblinking, as though waiting for him to make a decision. Suddenly, the hum stopped. Dead silence. And then, from the very depths of the dark, a voice echoed. Low and broken, as if it came from far beneath the earth, carrying with it an ancient weight. Don't trust the shadows. The words hung in the air, their meaning not quite clear, yet they struck Henry like a blow to the chest. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The shadows weren't just a feature of this place, they were the place. The darkness was alive. The hum wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, an entity, moving in the blackness, feeding off his fear. The voice spoke again, this time closer, clearer, as if it was no longer just an echo in the void. Henry, the voice dragged his name out slowly, almost like a whisper, but louder, more deliberate, as though it were testing him. Who are you? Henry demanded, his heart pounding. What do you want from me? The figure's face, if it was even a face, twisted. Its eyes began to stretch, distorting, until they no longer resembled human eyes at all, but dark pits, voids that seemed to pull everything into them. Henry took a step back, but the shadows surged forward, engulfing the air around him. The voice came again, now a chorus, overlapping itself, layered with hundreds of whispers. You shouldn't have come here. The ground beneath Henry's feet shifted, and he stumbled, his body struggling to maintain balance. The darkness seemed to grow, swallowing the edges of his vision until there was nothing left but the unfeeling void. Suddenly, the hum returned, louder than before, vibrating through Henry's chest, through his bones. He could feel it inside him now, clawing at his insides, seeping into his mind. Something moved in the darkness, a shape, an outline, something too tall to be human. It loomed over him, its shadow stretching impossibly long, and Henry could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on him, even though he could see nothing but the blackness. The whispering started again, this time a low, guttural voice mixed with the hissing of static. Henry. You shouldn't have come back. The words were like a jagged blade, slicing through the fog of his thoughts. His mind reeled. What did it mean? Come back. Had he been here before? His heart raced, but he couldn't stop. The darkness was closing in, tightening around him like a vice, and his legs refused to move. He was frozen, locked in place, unable to escape. Then, the shape moved closer. A pair of glowing eyes appeared from the darkness, slowly forming in the blackness. But they weren't human. They were too wide, too unnatural, like a predator's gaze. The light from the eyes flickered, revealing sharp, jagged features that seemed to shift in and out of focus. The air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before, and Henry's skin prickled as if an icy wind had cut through him. Henry, you shouldn't have found us. The words sent a chill down his spine, and with it came a sharp, gut-wrenching realization, this wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just some twisted dream. It was real. The eyes blinked, and in that instant, the world around Henry cracked open. The shadows erupted into chaotic movement, twisting in impossible directions, until everything seemed to fold in on itself, the air thickening with the sound of 1,000 whispers, all calling his name. Henry. Henry. He stumbled back, desperately trying to escape the grip of the shadows, but they were everywhere. The darkness pressed in from all sides, consuming him, pulling him deeper and deeper into its embrace. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind felt like it was being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the whispers stopped. The darkness vanished. Henry blinked, disoriented, unsure if he was awake or still trapped in whatever nightmare had taken hold of him. But as his vision cleared, he saw something. A figure. A man. It was Watson. But something was horribly wrong. The man standing before Henry was no longer the Watson he knew. His eyes were hollow, his face pale and stretched, his skin stretched too thin. He was still dressed in the clothes Henry had last seen him in, but his movements were stiff, jerky, unnatural. "Watson," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and its lips cracked into a twisted grin. "Henry," the voice wasn't Watson's. It was something else, something dark. "You're not getting out of here." The figure took a step toward him, and Henry's heart stopped. He turned and ran, but the darkness followed. Henry's feet pounded against the ground as he ran, his heart slamming in his chest like a drumbeat, each step heavy with dread. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was alive and closing in, swallowing everything in its path. His mind raced. How had things gotten so twisted? What was this place? What had happened to his friends, to the world around him? He dared not look back. He knew if he did, he would see it, Watson, or whatever had taken his place, chasing after him, its twisted grin and hollow eyes seared into his memory. But no matter how fast he ran, it felt like he was sinking deeper into the shadows. The darkness seemed endless, consuming everything, every sound, every trace of reality. It wasn't just the night that surrounded him, it was something far worse, something more sinister. The shadows weren't just in the forest, they were inside him, crawling beneath his skin, whispering his name. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his ears, in his mind, as though they were coming from all directions, from the trees, the ground, the very air he breathed. "Henry," the voice was soft at first, like a faint whisper on the wind. But it wasn't the wind, no, this voice was something darker. Something older. Something that knew him. He stumbled, his breath ragged, but the ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple, as if the earth itself was shifting, warping. The trees around him bent at impossible angles, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out to grab him. He could hear the creaking of the wood, the low moan of the forest, as if it were alive and aware of his every movement. The ground split open beneath him. Henry's eyes widened in horror as the earth cracked wide, a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch down into the very depths of hell. Dark, swirling tendrils of smoke rose from the abyss, and he could smell it, rot, decay, the stench of something ancient and long forgotten. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Sweat stung his eyes, but he didn't dare wipe it away. He had to stay focused, had to keep running, had to escape this nightmare. But the voices wouldn't stop. "Henry." They were louder now, so loud that they were deafening. His head throbbed as the whispers filled his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. His fingers curled into the dirt, his nails scraping against the earth as though it might give him some kind of release, some kind of escape. "Why are you running?" The voice came again, closer this time. Cold. Malevolent. Henry's blood ran cold. He had heard it before, this voice. It was the same voice that had spoken to him in the shadows. It was the voice of the darkness itself. His eyes flicked up to the sky, but there was no sky. There was only blackness. The trees above him had disappeared, and in their place stood a massive, towering shape, an indistinct, shifting figure that seemed to rise from the very ground. It was watching him. He could feel its gaze, pressing against his skin, crawling into his soul. The darkness seemed to twist and shift around him, folding in on itself, the tendrils of smoke curling closer, tightening around his throat. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The voice spoke again, now a chorus of thousands, all layered on top of each other, filling the space around him. "You shouldn't have come here, Henry." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The realization sank in like a stone, dragging him under. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. He shouldn't have come to this cursed place. He should have never listened to that fool's voice calling to him from the darkness. He should have never entered the forest. But it was too late now. The figure in front of him began to take shape, slowly, impossibly, forming into something more tangible. Henry's eyes widened in horror as the figure's face began to form out of the darkness, its features twisting into something both familiar and alien at once. It was Watson, or at least, it looked like Watson. But his eyes were black holes, empty voids, swallowing everything in their path. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones, pale and sickly. His lips were cracked, as though they had been pulled into an unnatural smile that didn't belong to him. And then there were the whispers. They came from every direction now, filling Henry's mind with maddening intensity, the voices growing louder, faster. Henry, the figure's voice was low, guttural, warped. It wasn't Watson's voice. It was something else, something wrong. You can't escape us. You've already given yourself to the darkness. Henry's breath caught in his throat. No. I haven't. The figure stepped forward, and Henry could feel it, its presence, its weight, pressing against him like a suffocating force. The air around him grew colder, sharper, and the ground beneath him seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, slow and methodical. The voices screamed in his mind. Henry, you're already one of us. Henry's legs gave way beneath him. He collapsed onto the ground, his hands scraping against the earth as if trying to crawl away, to escape, to do anything. But the darkness pressed down on him, suffocating him, holding him in place. He was trapped, unable to move, unable to breathe. His mind was screaming, but the voices drowned out his thoughts. His heart pounded in his chest, his body shaking with fear, as the figure loomed over him, its eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. You can't escape, the figure repeated, its voice low and steady. The darkness is inside you now. Henry gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror. He felt it, the pull of the darkness, dragging him deeper, pulling him into the abyss. His body trembled, his mind fractured. He couldn't fight it anymore. The darkness had already won. And then, as the figure reached out to touch him, everything went black. The whispers stopped. The darkness took him. Outro. As Henry's fate was sealed in that moment, so too does the story of the cursed forest linger in the shadows, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in, seeking answers they'll never find. So, what do you think happened to Henry? Did he truly become part of the darkness? Or is there something more waiting to be uncovered? Daniel thought he was just starting a regular job at an old building, cleaning up after hours. But as the night deepened, the air grew colder, and the silence became unbearable. Then, he heard it, a faint whisper, as though someone, or something, was calling him from deep within the building. He thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, but when he stumbled upon a locked door he'd never noticed before, everything changed. What lay behind that door wasn't just dust and old furniture, it was something far more terrifying. Was it too late to leave, or had he already crossed a line no one should ever cross? Imagine a town where no one talks about the things that go bump in the night. They smile, they wave, they go about their day, but behind every closed door, there's an unspoken fear. For years, the people of Hollow Creek have lived in silence, hiding a terrible secret. It starts with a whisper. A voice that calls your name when no one else is around. Then, the nightmares begin, where you're awake, but you're not alone. And as the days pass, you start to wonder if the ghost of Hollow Creek is a myth, or if it's been living inside you all along. What would you do if you couldn't trust your own mind? Hollow Creek had always been quiet. The kind of quiet that was almost unnerving, the kind where every rustle of leaves or distant creak of a door seemed amplified. To most outsiders, it was the perfect escape, a sleepy town tucked away in the hills, far from the noise and chaos of the city. But for Lucas, it was a town with a past that was much darker than anyone cared to admit. He had left Hollow Creek 5 years ago, hoping to escape the weight of family secrets and quiet town gossip. But now, returning after so long, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Maybe it was just the distance of time, or maybe it was the unsettling silence that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. As Lucas drove into town, the familiar sights should have brought comfort, but instead, they felt wrong. The old diner where he and Daniel had spent countless afternoons was still there, but the lights flickered in a way that made his skin crawl. The gas station had a thick layer of dust over its pumps, like it hadn't been used in ages, though he could see a truck parked out back. And the streets? They were too empty, too quiet. No kids playing on the sidewalks, no groups of neighbors chatting by their porches. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. His childhood friend, Daniel, had invited him back for a reunion of sorts. Lucas hadn't wanted to come at first. He'd been content in the city, far away from the mysteries that Hollow Creek seemed to be wrapped in. But something about Daniel's letter had made him reconsider. There was an urgency in the words, something unspoken. "I need you to come back, Lucas. There's something you need to know." It was late afternoon by the time Lucas arrived at Daniel's house, a small, weathered cottage at the edge of town. As he parked, he couldn't help but notice the flickering of lights in the windows, as though someone was moving inside. The house was surrounded by thick trees that rustled unnaturally in the wind. His pulse quickened as he approached the door and knocked. It creaked open on its own. "Daniel?" Lucas called out, stepping inside, his voice tinged with uncertainty. The house smelled of stale air and old wood, and the faint sound of a ticking clock echoed through the silence. He stepped further in, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet. No response. A chill ran down his spine, but he dismissed it. Maybe Daniel was just upstairs. He was always the type to disappear for a while before making his presence known. Lucas wandered through the rooms, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he was trying not to disturb something that was already disturbed. When he reached the kitchen, he stopped. On the table was an old newspaper, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. The headline caught his eye. "Another missing person in Hollow Creek, no signs of struggle." His stomach twisted. He'd heard rumors about the disappearances before, but he thought they were just that, rumors. Now, seeing it in black and white, the weight of the reality hit him. It had been happening for years. People vanishing, only to return weeks later, changed, different somehow. They didn't speak about it, didn't acknowledge it, but everyone knew. The people of Hollow Creek had stopped asking questions. A creak from upstairs interrupted his thoughts. He turned quickly, his heart pounding. "Daniel?" he called again, more urgently now. But the house was silent. He began to ascend the stairs, each step slower than the last, his nerves tightening with every creak. The air was thick now, heavy, suffocating. When he reached the top, he saw it, something that made his blood run cold. At the end of the hallway, the door to Daniel's bedroom was wide open, but the room inside was shrouded in darkness. Without thinking, Lucas stepped forward. The instant he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. He whipped around, his pulse spiking, but the door was already locked from the inside. Panic bubbled up inside him as he tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on the door, shouting Daniel's name, but there was no answer. And then, the silence. It was in that silence that Lucas heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But it grew louder, clearer, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. "Leave, now." Lucas froze, his breath catching in his throat. His skin prickled, and his heart hammered in his chest. The voice wasn't Daniel's, and it wasn't anyone he knew. It was something else, something old, something that had been here long before him. "Leave, now." The whisper grew louder, echoing around him, pressing in on his mind, like it was trying to claw its way into his thoughts. Panic surged through Lucas as he pounded harder on the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," he screamed, his voice breaking. "Daniel! Let me out." But then, through the darkness, something moved. A shadow, tall and thin, flickered in the corner of his eye. He turned to face it, but there was nothing there. Still, He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something lurking just beyond his vision. The whisper came again, but this time, it was louder, more forceful, almost like a command. "Leave, now, or you'll never leave." Lucas's hands were shaking as he turned back to the door. He had to get out, had to get away from whatever was in this house with him. He yanked on the door handle again, and this time, it gave. With a rush of relief, he stumbled back into the hallway, gasping for air. But when he turned to look, the hallway was different. The walls seemed closer, the corners darker. His mind was playing tricks on him. He took a step, but his foot caught on something, a piece of paper. He bent down to pick it up and saw it was a torn page from a journal. Written in frantic handwriting, it read, "It's not the house. It's inside us. The ghost doesn't haunt the place. It haunts the mind." His breath hitched in his chest as a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The whispering started again, only this time it was louder, closer, inside his head. He looked down the stairs. The house was empty, but it wasn't. The ghost of Hollow Creek had already found him. Lucas didn't sleep that night. The house, Daniel's house, had been silent since he had escaped the locked room. The whispering had stopped, but it lingered in his mind, like an echo that refused to fade. He couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. It wasn't just the house that felt haunted, it was the entire town. Hollow Creek seemed to watch him from the shadows, pressing in on him with every step he took. He couldn't stay here. The town had changed, but something about it felt familiar, in a way that made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the disappearances, it was the feeling that something dark had always been lurking beneath the surface of this sleepy little town. The people had stopped asking questions long ago, and now they lived in a kind of quiet denial. But that wasn't going to be enough for Lucas. Not anymore. The morning came, and the sun cast a cold, pale light through the curtains of Daniel's living room. He stood at the window, looking out onto the empty street, the stillness pressing in on him. The town was quiet as always. Yet, there was an unsettling feeling that gnawed at him. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is waiting. He knew he had to speak to Daniel. Whatever had happened last night, whatever he had heard and seen, had to make sense. He couldn't leave without understanding. But when he went upstairs to Daniel's room, he found it empty. The bed hadn't been touched, and the air in the room felt strangely cold. He quickly checked the rest of the house, nothing. No sign of Daniel anywhere. Panic began to claw at him again, but he forced it back. Daniel had probably gone out. Maybe to the diner. It didn't make sense, but it was the only explanation he could come up with. As he made his way to the front door, Lucas's gaze fell on something that stopped him cold. On the small table near the door was an envelope. His name was written on it in sharp, precise handwriting. He hesitated for a moment, his pulse quickening. He hadn't seen Daniel write anything like this before. The handwriting looked almost too perfect, too calculated. He opened the envelope slowly, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The words written on it were chilling, but the thing that made Lucas's heart race was the unmistakable smell of old, decaying paper, like something ancient. The whispering has begun. It knows you're here. Do not trust anyone. You're not alone anymore. The past never left, and neither will you. The paper slipped from his hand and fluttered to the ground as Lucas stumbled back, his mind racing. This was real. Whatever was happening in Hollow Creek wasn't just in his head. Suddenly, he heard the soft creak of floorboards from upstairs. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable. Someone was here. He didn't have to ask who. Daniel. Heart pounding, Lucas rushed upstairs. The house was unnaturally still, the silence suffocating as he moved through each room, calling out his friend's name. The floor creaked under his feet with every step, but there was no response. The smell of decay seemed stronger now, as though it was seeping from the walls themselves. He reached Daniel's room, and to his shock, the door was open. It had been closed when he left the room earlier. The room itself seemed darker, the shadows thicker than before. As he stepped inside, he felt the weight of the air pressing down on him, like something unseen was watching him. Then, the whispering returned. But this time, it was louder. It came from behind him, from the corner of the room, so faint at first that he almost thought it was his imagination. "Leave now." The voice was familiar, yet not. It was almost as if it were Daniel's voice, but twisted and distorted, like an echo from another time. Lucas spun around, his heart racing. But when he looked, there was nothing there. The room was empty. Except for the cold draft that sent a shiver down his spine. The whisper came again, only this time, it wasn't from behind him. It was in front of him. The shadows at the far side of the room shifted, as if something was moving in the darkness. "Leave now, or you'll never leave." It was almost a command, a warning that cut through the air like a knife. Lucas took a step back, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. His body trembled as the whisper grew louder, more urgent, and then it stopped. The room was silent. And then, something else happened. Something that made Lucas freeze in place. The door to Daniel's closet, which he knew had been empty just a few moments ago, creaked open, as if moved by an unseen hand. Lucas's heart raced as he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the dark opening. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the room felt colder than it had before. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling, but before he could touch it, something inside the closet moved. A figure, hunched and unnatural, shifted in the dark. The form seemed to blend into the shadows, like it wasn't quite solid, yet at the same time, it was. And then, it whispered again. "Come closer." Lucas recoiled, stepping back quickly. His mind screamed for him to run, to get out of the house before whatever it was could touch him. But his feet refused to move, rooted to the spot in terror. The whisper grew louder, louder than the pounding of his own heart. "Come closer." His eyes locked onto the shape in the dark, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw something, a face, pale and twisted with an expression of hunger, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He turned and ran. Lucas bolted from the room, his feet barely touching the stairs as he fled down them, the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He ran out of the house, gasping for breath, his mind unable to process the horror he had just witnessed. But as he reached the front door, he stopped. The world around him was silent. There was no sound, no breeze. He stood there for a long moment, eyes wide, chest heaving. And then, he saw it. In the distance, across the street, standing in the middle of the empty road, was Daniel. His figure was rigid, unmoving, like he was frozen in place. But the worst part? His eyes were empty. Blank. There was no one left inside. The hollow creek he had once known was gone. And it was never going to let him leave. Lucas stumbled back down the road, his legs feeling like they could give way beneath him at any moment. His breath was ragged, his heart still hammering in his chest from the sight of Daniel standing in the middle of the street, his empty eyes staring out like a lost soul. The whole town seemed to hold its breath, as if it was waiting for something to happen. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes watching from every corner. He couldn't escape the thought that whatever was happening in Hollow Creek, whatever had happened to Daniel, was coming for him next. And he had no idea how to stop it. He turned a corner, his mind racing. What had he seen? Was it truly Daniel? Or had something taken over him, twisted him into something unrecognizable? The more Lucas tried to reason it out, the more it slipped away from him. The sense of dread was growing stronger by the second, and with each step he took, he could feel the town closing in on him like a trap. The streets were empty, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant groan of a creaking building. Yet, there was an eerie stillness that seemed to hum in the air. It wasn't normal. It never had been. His thoughts kept returning to the house, the way the whispers had felt real, like they were coming from inside his own head. That voice in the shadows, the figure that had moved in the closet, and most of all, the twisted expression on Daniel's face, it all pointed to something far worse than he could have imagined. The only person who might know something was Elijah. He had lived here all his life and had never once shown the kind of nervousness that Lucas had seen in the other townsfolk. But now, as Lucas stood before the small, decaying diner that Elijah ran, he wasn't sure what he'd find inside. Would Elijah be able to help? Or was he just another part of the town's dark secret? He pushed the door open slowly, the bell above the door chiming as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and grease. The place was quiet, too quiet, even for this time of day. It wasn't until Lucas saw Elijah sitting in the corner, his head down, that he realized just how wrong everything had become. "Lucas, you're back," Elijah's voice was hoarse, and for the first time, Lucas noticed how tired he looked. The bags under his eyes were deep, his face pale, as though he hadn't seen the sun in days. "I don't know what's happening, Elijah," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what's going on in this town. What happened to Daniel? Why did he look like that? What's happening to all of us?" Elijah's eyes flicked up, his gaze darting nervously around the room, as if expecting someone to be listening. He motioned for Lucas to sit, his hand trembling as he wiped it on his pants. The old man took a long, shaky breath, as though summoning the courage to speak. "I knew you'd come," Elijah muttered, almost to himself. "I knew you'd be the one to see it. We all did, you know. The others in the town, they feel it, too. But none of us can talk about it. Not openly. Not anymore." "What do you mean?" Lucas asked, his voice lowering, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "What's happening to us?" Elijah's gaze drifted to the window, his expression haunted. He hesitated for a long moment before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've seen the figure, haven't you?" Elijah asked. His words sent a chill through Lucas's body, as if Elijah knew exactly what Lucas had experienced the night before. "The figure?" Lucas repeated, unsure if he wanted to hear the answer. Elijah nodded. "It's not just a person. It's something older than this town, older than anything you can imagine. The town's been cursed for years, Lucas. It's been feeding off us, feeding off our fear, our confusion. And now it's getting stronger. It has been for a long time, but no one's been willing to face it." "What is it?" Lucas asked, his mind racing. "It's a presence, something that haunts the very ground we walk on. It takes people, changes them into something else. It feeds on them, on their souls. I've seen it happen before. Daniel. He's gone. I'm sorry." Lucas felt his stomach tighten as the words hit him. "But, what about me? What's going to happen to me?" His voice was nearly frantic, but he couldn't stop himself from asking. It was a question that had been haunting him since he'd seen Daniel's lifeless eyes, and now he needed answers. "I don't know," Elijah admitted, his eyes filled with sorrow. "But you need to leave. You're not safe here anymore. None of us are." Lucas stood up abruptly. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He couldn't process what Elijah was saying, he couldn't wrap his mind around it. Something ancient, something evil was consuming the town, and no one could stop it. It was too late for that. Leave? Where am I supposed to go? What's happening to this place? Lucas demanded. "There's no leaving Hollow Creek," Elijah replied quietly. "Not unless you're willing to face it. The town, the figure, the whispers, it's all connected. And if you stay here, you're going to become part of it. You'll never leave. Not truly." Lucas stood there, frozen, as a horrible realization began to settle into his bones. He hadn't seen the worst of it. The worst was still coming. Just then, the door to the diner creaked open, and Lucas's heart skipped a beat. A shadow stood in the doorway, a tall, thin figure, its outline barely visible against the dim light outside. Elijah froze. His face turned pale as he backed away from the counter, his eyes wide with terror. And then, in a voice that was nothing like Elijah's usual calm tone, he whispered, "It's here." Lucas turned, slowly, but he couldn't bring himself to look at the figure. He knew, deep down, that whatever it was had been watching him from the very first moment he'd stepped foot in this cursed town. The whispering began again, this time louder, closer, a voice almost as if it were inside his own mind. His legs trembled beneath him, and the shadows in the diner stretched, growing darker, closer. Then, the door slammed shut. And the diner was plunged into darkness. The darkness seemed to press in around Lucas, suffocating him. Every breath he took felt heavier, the air thick with an unnatural chill. He could hear the distant rattle of a window in the back, the creak of the old diner's walls, but it was the silence that unnerved him most. The kind of silence that seemed to swallow up every sound, leaving only the pounding of his heart in his ears. For a moment, he thought the figure standing in the doorway might just be another trick of his mind, an illusion conjured by the fear that had taken root in him since his arrival in Hollow Creek. But the oppressive air in the diner told him otherwise. There was something real standing before him, something that wasn't quite human. It felt like the shadows themselves were alive, stretching and writhing in the corners of the room, as if the figure in the doorway was casting them into existence. Elijah. Lucas's voice was barely a whisper, cracking as the fear began to overtake him. "What is that?" Elijah didn't answer at first. His eyes, wide with terror, were locked on the figure as if he were seeing a ghost. No, something far worse than that. The man's face was pale, almost sickly, and his lips trembled as he glanced at Lucas, his voice shaking. It's come," he murmured, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "It's finally here." Lucas took a step back, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. He couldn't look away from the figure, which stood there motionless in the doorway, its silhouette barely visible against the dim light of the street outside. It didn't move. It didn't need to. And then, it spoke. A soft whisper, like a voice that shouldn't have been there at all, echoed through the diner. It came from the figure, but it felt like it was inside Lucas's mind, burrowing into his thoughts. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a jolt of ice through his veins. It wasn't a voice. It was something else, something that bled into his soul. He couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of it. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more it pressed against him, pushing him toward the brink of madness. Elijah staggered back, his face drained of all color. He was trembling, his hands clutching at the edge of the counter, as though he were about to collapse. "It's here to take you," Elijah managed to say, his voice low and hoarse, barely audible. "It's been waiting." The figure shifted slightly, its shape becoming clearer, though it still remained mostly hidden in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. Its face, obscured in darkness, was unreadable, but Lucas could feel its gaze on him, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He couldn't look away, even though every instinct in him screamed to flee. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The walls of the diner seemed to pulse, breathing along with the figure, as if it were part of the very fabric of the building. The whispers grew louder, surrounding Lucas, burrowing deep inside his skull. He couldn't tell where they were coming from, whether they were coming from the figure, from Elijah, or from some dark, hidden part of his own mind. The voices blended into a maddening hum, filling his thoughts with fragments of memories and images he didn't recognize. Faces of people he had never met flickered in and out of his vision. And then, as if it were some sort of dark ritual, the figure spoke again. "Why did you come to Hollow Creek, Lucas? Did you think you could escape it?" "Escape me?" The words were sharp, jagged, each syllable cutting through the air like a knife. Lucas's heart stopped, his blood turning to ice. He hadn't told anyone why he was here. How could it know? The answer came before he could even ask it. The figure's form shifted again, its long arms outstretched, its hands moving slowly toward him, as though it were in no hurry to end this. There was something ancient, something insidious about its movements, as if it had been waiting for years, centuries even, to claim him. The air was thick with its presence. Lucas could feel it moving inside him, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice, squeezing harder with every passing second. "You're not like the others," the figure whispered. "You don't belong. And now you'll never leave." Fear gripped him like a vice. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. The words weren't just words, they were promises. Dark promises that filled him with a sense of impending doom. Behind him, Elijah fell to his knees, his voice broken as he muttered, "I tried to stop it. I tried to warn you. But it's too late. You've already crossed the line." Lucas's mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding around him. Hollow Creek wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, consumed by something far worse than ghosts or demons. Whatever had taken over Daniel, whatever had caused the whispers and shadows, was alive and hungry. And it was feeding on them all. Without warning, the figure stepped forward, its limbs twisting unnaturally, its long fingers brushing against Lucas's face. The coldness of its touch sent a wave of nausea through him. It wasn't like touching anything physical, it was more like something that existed between worlds, something that should not be able to touch him, yet somehow, it did. In that moment, Lucas felt a deep, terrible realization. The figure wasn't just some malevolent entity. It was a force, a presence, woven into the very fabric of the town itself. Hollow Creek was nothing more than a prison for the souls it had claimed, and Lucas was its next victim. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, its lips curling into a twisted smile that never quite reached its eyes. Its voice, low and menacing, filled Lucas's mind once more. "Welcome to your new home." The world around Lucas seemed to collapse in on itself. The diner, the streets outside, even Elijah, everything blurred and became indistinct, as if it were all just a dream. But it wasn't a dream. Lucas could feel the cold, the damp, the pressure of something unseen bearing down on him. He was awake. And he was trapped. And in that moment, Lucas realized the horrifying truth: there was no escape from Hollow Creek. Not for him. Not for anyone. The door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into an even darker, more suffocating silence. The silence inside the diner was deafening now. It was as if the world had stopped moving altogether, holding its breath. The figure that had haunted Lucas's every thought was standing right before him, just inches away, its cold, spectral presence seeping into his very skin. It was no longer just a shadow in the doorway, it had come for him. And Lucas knew, deep down, that there was nothing he could do to stop it. His body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or scream. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to obey, as if the very air had thickened around him, trapping him in this nightmare. He tried to turn his head, to look at Elijah, to find some shred of comfort or clarity, but his gaze remained locked on the figure. The figure didn't move, its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, staring straight into Lucas's soul. The longer he stared, the more he felt like he was being drawn in, sucked into something deeper, darker, than he could comprehend. It was like the figure wasn't just watching him, it was inside him, tearing apart his thoughts, his very identity. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind, sharp and insistent, a voice that wasn't his own but sounded as if it came from the very depths of Hollow Creek itself. "You've been chosen, Lucas." The words were like an electric shock, sending a tremor through his entire body. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but his mouth was dry, his throat tight. He couldn't even swallow. The figure moved closer, its shape shifting, elongating. Its presence filled the room, darkening everything around it. The temperature plummeted, the air growing thick with a stifling heaviness. Then, in the silence that followed, there was a sudden sound, a soft, distant cry. It echoed from somewhere far beyond the diner, from the heart of the town. A sound that made Lucas's skin crawl, the kind of sound that pierced the soul and twisted it into something unrecognizable. "Elijah," Lucas whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible, "what's happening? What is that?" But Elijah didn't respond. He was kneeling on the floor now, his face twisted in fear, his body shaking violently. He wasn't even looking at Lucas anymore. His eyes were fixed on something Lucas couldn't see. And then it hit him, the realization that made his blood run cold. Elijah wasn't just afraid of the figure. Elijah was afraid of everything. Before Lucas could say anything more, the cry came again, this time louder, closer. It was like the sound of someone, or something, calling out in agony, a desperate, tortured wail that reverberated through the walls of the diner. It was coming from the direction of the old cemetery, a place that had always been off-limits, a place people spoke of only in hushed whispers. The diner itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the sound, the floorboards creaking in protest, the windows rattling as if some invisible force was pressing against them. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into an impenetrable darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow of the streetlights outside, filtering in through the fog that had rolled in from nowhere, swirling like smoke. In the distance, the faintest hint of movement could be seen, shapes that shouldn't have been there, like shadows dancing just beyond the edge of reality. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He knew that whatever was happening, whatever was causing the wailing cry, it was connected to Hollow Creek's dark past. He could feel it deep in his bones. This wasn't just some random ghost. It wasn't a simple haunting. This was something older, something far more sinister. And it was coming for them. With trembling hands, Lucas reached for the flashlight that lay on the counter beside him, but before he could turn it on, the door to the diner burst open with a deafening crash. The cold wind outside swept through the room like a living thing, extinguishing any warmth that remained. And standing in the doorway was a figure, no, not the same one, but something equally terrifying. A woman. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through Lucas. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her face, and her clothes were torn and ragged, as if she had been wandering the streets of Hollow Creek for years. "Elijah," she whispered in a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of the grave. "You shouldn't have come. It's already too late for you." Elijah's breath hitched in his throat, his eyes widening in terror. He scrambled backward, his legs collapsing beneath him, as if he were trying to escape something too terrible to comprehend. But it was already here. The woman's eyes locked onto Lucas, and he felt the same sensation again, that suffocating feeling that something was crawling inside his skin, burrowing deep into his mind. She didn't say a word, but he could feel her presence in every fiber of his being, pressing in on him, suffocating him. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure of the woman was gone, vanished into the darkness like a fleeting shadow, leaving only the echo of her words lingering in the air. "You can never leave." Lucas's breath caught in his throat. The words seemed to linger in the air like an omen, a promise of doom. He turned to look at Elijah, his eyes filled with questions, but Elijah had already begun to stand, his face pale and haunted. His lips moved, but no words came out. Do you know who that was?" Lucas asked, his voice shaking. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he turned to face the door, his eyes wide with terror. The cries were louder now, and they were getting closer, coming from the direction of the cemetery. "We have to leave," Elijah said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. "Now. Before it's too late." But as he spoke, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the walls around them trembling. A low, guttural growl filled the room, rising from the depths of the earth itself, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then, the diner door slammed shut, trapping them inside. Lucas turned back toward the door, his mind reeling. Whatever was happening, whatever evil force had taken hold of Hollow Creek, it wasn't finished. It was far from finished. And now, it had them in its grip. In the growing darkness, the air felt colder than it ever had before. The echoes of the cries, the howls of anguish, seemed to surround them, filling every inch of the room. Lucas's heart raced, and his pulse quickened as he realized the horrifying truth. They weren't alone anymore. The room felt as if it had been carved out of stone, impossible to escape, suffocating in its silence. The world outside, once filled with noise and life, now seemed a distant memory, like a dream slipping further and further away. Lucas's breath came in shallow gasps as his mind grappled with the nightmare that had unfolded in front of him. The woman, the wails, everything had blurred into one horrible, ungraspable reality. "It's not real. It's not real," Lucas whispered to himself, his voice trembling. He kept repeating the words like a mantra, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how hard he tried, the images, the sensations, wouldn't leave him. They were stuck inside his head, swirling in a maddening whirlpool that threatened to consume him. Beside him, Elijah sat hunched over, his hands clutching his head as if trying to hold it together. His eyes were wide with fear, his pupils dilated as if he were seeing something that no one else could see. The air in the diner had grown thicker, heavier. It wasn't just the weight of the darkness, it was something deeper, something that seeped into their very thoughts. "What's happening to us?" Lucas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Elijah didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked up toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. The muffled wails from the cemetery were growing louder, each cry more desperate, more chilling than the last. I don't know," Elijah murmured, his voice hollow. "But I think it's happening to all of us. To everyone in this town. We can't escape it. We can't run away." Lucas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He turned away, trying to block out the sound of Elijah's words, but they lingered in his mind, twisting like a knife. He could still see the figure, the woman, with her hollow eyes, her words haunting him, "You can never leave." He thought about it, turning the phrase over and over in his mind, trying to make sense of it. What did she mean by that? Was it a warning? A curse? Suddenly, the air seemed to shift. The walls of the diner, once solid and unyielding, now seemed to breathe with the same twisted rhythm as the cries outside. The temperature dropped again, but this time it wasn't the cold of the wind or the night air. It felt as though the very room had become alive, aware, watching. "Lucas," Elijah's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts, raw with fear. "Look." Lucas's eyes snapped to Elijah, but the words caught in his throat. Elijah's face was distorted, his features twisted in a way that was unnatural, wrong. His expression was a mixture of terror and despair, but what really caught Lucas's attention were the eyes. Elijah's pupils were no longer just black, they were gray, swirling with something not human. No, Elijah, this isn't you," Lucas whispered, backing away, his heart racing. But Elijah didn't respond. Instead, he began muttering under his breath, his words incoherent, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He looked like he was speaking to someone, or something, that wasn't there. "They're in our heads, Lucas. They're in all of us," Elijah whispered, his voice shaky. "This place, it's all part of it. The town, the people, the fog, it pulls you in, makes you believe things you never thought possible. It warps your mind until you can't tell what's real anymore. Until you're trapped." Lucas took another step back, his pulse quickening. The room was beginning to feel claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on him. His thoughts were becoming jumbled, confused. He wanted to leave, wanted to break free from the oppressive atmosphere, but no matter how much he tried, his body refused to move. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. What was he seeing? What was he hearing? The cries had stopped, but they had been replaced by something far worse, the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't a relief. It was an absence, an emptiness that swallowed everything. Lucas couldn't even hear the sound of his own breathing anymore. His thoughts, his sense of time, had become disconnected, as if they were floating in a vast, endless void. I don't understand, Lucas whispered to himself, the words falling out like a confession. Why is this happening? What do they want from us? A cold, guttural voice answered from the shadows, one that didn't belong to Elijah. They want everything from you, Lucas, the voice echoed, reverberating off the walls, bouncing around in his skull. They want your fear, your mind, your soul. And once they have you, they will never let you go. Lucas's heart skipped a beat, his body trembling as he turned to see where the voice had come from. But there was nothing, no one. Just the darkened corners of the diner and the fog creeping in through the window. You aren't real, Lucas muttered, the words barely audible. He wasn't sure if he was talking to himself or to whatever was watching him. But then Elijah spoke again, his voice no longer his own. It was deeper now, more guttural, a strange rasp that wasn't human. It's too late, Lucas. Don't you understand? They've already chosen us. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the floor beneath their feet began to shake. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, something ancient, something buried deep beneath Hollow Creek, finally stirring. Lucas could feel it, the weight of it, pressing against his chest, squeezing the breath out of him. His vision blurred, the room spinning, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was awake or trapped in a nightmare. Everything felt unreal, a twisted distortion of reality. Stop it! Lucas shouted, though he wasn't sure who or what he was shouting at. He wanted to believe that this was just a dream, that he would wake up, that everything would go back to normal. But deep down, he knew the truth. The truth that had been staring him in the face since the moment he stepped into this cursed town. There was no waking up. There was no escaping. It's not a curse, Lucas, Elijah's voice rasped. It's a promise. The diner's lights flickered violently, and for a split second, Lucas thought he saw something, or someone, standing in the doorway. His heart leaped in his chest, but when he looked again, it was gone. Just like the woman. Just like everything else. The voice came again, colder than before, seeping into his thoughts. You're already a part of Hollow Creek now. And we never let anyone go. Everything around Lucas began to fade, his vision, his thoughts, his sense of time. It was like the town itself was swallowing him whole, erasing him from existence, turning him into one more memory, lost and forgotten. His last thought, the only one he could hold on to, was a question, one that would haunt him forever. Was Elijah ever really here at all? The fog had become thicker, heavier, pressing in on Lucas like a living entity, suffocating his every breath. He had wandered through Hollow Creek for what felt like days, weeks, months, he wasn't sure anymore. Time had lost all meaning. The once familiar streets now looked like they belonged to a place that wasn't quite real. Every corner, every building, seemed to stretch on forever, warping into twisted shadows that reached out with ghostly fingers. And then there was the sound. The whispers. The voices that followed him everywhere, echoing in his mind, scraping against his sanity. You can't leave, Lucas. You're one of us now, the voice of Elijah had murmured that morning. But was it Elijah? Or had the town itself swallowed him whole, leaving behind nothing but an empty vessel, a puppet for the horrors that now controlled everything? Lucas stumbled, his body weak from hunger, from fear, from the weight of the curse. He tried to remember how he got here, tried to trace the steps that led him to this moment, but the memories were slipping away like sand through his fingers. The only thing he could feel, the only thing he could hear, was the relentless presence of Hollow Creek, closing in around him. It was then that he saw it, the house. The one that had been calling to him since he first stepped into this forsaken town. The one that had stood there, waiting, like a shadowed sentinel. It was an old, decrepit mansion at the far edge of the town, a place he had avoided until now. But he couldn't fight it anymore. Something drew him in, something inside him screaming to enter, to confront whatever nightmare had been festering inside Hollow Creek all these years. "You're almost home," the voice echoed in his mind again, smoother now, almost affectionate. Was it the town? The woman from the cemetery? Or was it something worse? Whatever it was, Lucas had no choice but to follow it. As he approached the mansion, the door creaked open by itself. He didn't question it. He didn't have the strength to. All he could think of was the oppressive silence that had taken over the town. The terrifying wails had stopped. The fog had thickened. And now, this. The interior was like something out of a fever dream. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floorboards groaned beneath his every step, and the air was thick with a coldness that sank into his bones. There were no windows. No escape. And then, there she was. The woman from the cemetery. The one who had warned him. But now, she was different, more powerful, more real than ever before. Her eyes locked onto his, hollow and endless, and her smile stretched unnaturally wide. "Welcome home, Lucas," she said in a voice that sounded like it was made of both laughter and pain. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body refused to move. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The woman stepped closer, her presence filling the entire room, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been part of us all along," she whispered, her breath cold against his skin. "Hollow Creek isn't a town, Lucas. It's a memory. A place that lives, and breathes, and grows with the fear of those who come here. And now, it has you." Lucas tried to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his chest tight. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of them making sense. "What do you want from me?" he finally choked out. Her smile widened, almost in amusement. She reached out and touched his cheek, and he felt a cold rush of dread wash over him. Her touch burned, not physically, but in a way that made his soul ache. It was like she was pulling something from deep within him, something he hadn't even realized was there. A part of him that had been lost long before he ever arrived in Hollow Creek. "I want nothing from you, Lucas," she said softly, as if speaking to a child. "But I'll take everything from you, just the same." The room began to warp around him, the walls bending and contorting in unnatural ways. The floor beneath his feet began to tremble, as if the very foundation of the house was cracking apart. The whispers were growing louder, their voices now a cacophony of anguished cries, taunting him. And then, something shifted. The woman stepped back, her gaze never leaving his, and the shadows behind her seemed to come alive. They reached out, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward them with a force that was stronger than any physical grip. "No! No!" Lucas screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the overwhelming sound of the wailing spirits, their tortured cries filling the room. It was too much. The pressure, the fear, the pain. His mind was on the brink of shattering, and he could feel it. His sanity was slipping through his fingers like water. "You are one of us now, Lucas," the woman whispered again, her voice final. "You're part of Hollow Creek." His eyes filled with tears, his vision blurring as the shadows enveloped him. His body went limp, and the last thing he heard was the deafening roar of the spirits around him, their voices screaming as they pulled him into the darkness. The town of Hollow Creek had claimed him. His body, his soul, everything. And just as the darkness swallowed him whole, Lucas realized one terrible truth. There was no escape. The town didn't just trap you in its physical boundaries. It trapped you in your mind, in your memories, in your very essence. Hollow Creek never let anyone go. It didn't need to. It lived within them, festered in their fear, and fed on their minds. Those who arrived never left. They became part of the town's endless cycle of torment, forever lost in the fog, their souls twisted and forever bound to the place that had cursed them. And Lucas, like all the others before him, was now just another whisper in the wind. As the final screams faded into the night, Hollow Creek remained, untouched, timeless. But don't think for a second that it's over. No, the curse lingers, always waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far, to hear the whispers, to be drawn into its twisted embrace. You may be safe for now, but remember, some places never let go. Some places never let you leave. Have you ever been so deep into a project that you lose track of time, only to realize the world around you is changing? Emily and her best friend, Mia, were working on a school assignment late into the night. But when strange things began happening, things that couldn't be explained, there was no turning back. Whispers echoed through the dark, and the shadows seemed to grow longer. Was it just the stress of the night, or had they uncovered something they should have left alone? Emily was about to find out, but would she make it out alive? The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of Emily's bedroom. The streetlights cast long, faint shadows, stretching across the walls, dancing in tune with the movement of the trees outside. Inside, the air felt unnaturally still, a heavy silence filling the room except for the soft rustling of paper as Emily and Mia worked at the desk. It was well past midnight now, and the world outside had become a ghostly blur of darkened streets and distant lights. But in Emily's bedroom, the two girls were oblivious to everything except their school project, until the air began to change. Emily's eyes darted over the words in the old journal she had found in the back of the library. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded in some places but still legible enough to read. The details about the midnight ritual seemed absurd at first, like the kind of myth they used to scare kids into staying in at night. But something about it was different, compelling, almost magnetic. Her heart raced with excitement as she scanned the words, feeling the strange weight of them pressing against her chest. There was mention of an ancient ritual that took place only at midnight, under the full moon, designed to summon something from beyond the veil. The more she read, the more it felt like a puzzle begging to be solved. Emily, Mia's voice broke through her thoughts, shaking her back to reality. She turned to face her friend, who sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes wide with concern. I really don't think we should be doing this. It feels wrong. Emily's lips curled into a smile, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. It's just a story, Mia. But if it's real, don't you want to know? Mia looked at her friend, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the bed. She knew Emily. Her curiosity often led her down paths that no one else would dare to follow. But this was different. The air felt wrong. Heavy. Like the room itself was holding its breath. Please, Emily, Mia whispered, almost pleading. We don't need to do this. We'll finish the project tomorrow, just go to bed, okay? But Emily was already standing up, her determination written all over her face. I have to know, Mia. We'll just try it. It won't take long. Mia stood up, walking over to Emily. She grabbed her friend's arm, holding it tightly. Emily, listen to me, she said, her voice desperate. Whatever happens, promise me we'll stop if anything feels wrong. Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I promise. The two girls went to work, gathering the things they needed for the ritual, 2 candles, a matchbox, and the journal. The instructions were simple enough: light the candles, say the incantation, and wait. But as they arranged everything in a circle on the floor, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was like someone, or something, was waiting for them to make a mistake. The room seemed to grow colder, despite the heat coming from the candles. A soft, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the air, so faint that at first, Emily thought it was just her imagination. But then Mia heard it too. A whisper, soft and distant, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the walls. Mia, did you hear that? Emily whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. Mia turned, her face pale, her eyes wide. I don't hear anything, Emily. You're freaking me out. But Emily had heard it, louder now, clearer. The whisper wasn't coming from anywhere in the room, and it didn't sound like it came from the outside either. It was coming from within the room itself. It was as though the very air around them was alive. As Emily began to recite the incantation, her voice shaky but firm, Mia's heart began to race. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, but still unintelligible. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with them. Emily's voice faltered, but she pressed on, the words flowing from her lips as if they had been rehearsed for a lifetime. "Emily, stop!" Mia begged, her voice rising in panic. "This isn't right. I feel it, something's wrong." But it was too late. The air in the room seemed to thicken, suffocating them. Emily could barely breathe, but she forced herself to continue, her voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. She was so close to knowing the truth. Then, all at once, the candles flickered. The room grew colder still, and the whispers turned into a low, guttural murmur. Emily stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening with disbelief. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, moving unnaturally across the walls. And then, in the corner of the room, something shifted, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Did you see that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Emily turned slowly, her body frozen with terror. A figure, dark, indistinct, stood in the corner of the room, watching them. It didn't move, but it felt like it was drawing closer. Its presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her chest. A cold hand wrapped around Emily's heart. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. But she couldn't look away either. The figure in the corner was getting closer. The whispers grew louder, louder still, until they filled her mind, drowning out everything else. The room began to spin. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Emily gasped for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The candles had extinguished, and the room was now plunged into darkness. Mia stood beside her, her breath ragged and quick. "Emily, what did we just do?" Mia asked, her voice trembling with terror. But Emily didn't answer. She was too busy staring into the darkness, her eyes wide with fear. Something was in the room with them. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. And it was far from done. The whispers continued, now louder, more insistent. They echoed in her mind, taunting her, asking her to follow them. But Emily didn't want to know where they led. Not anymore. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. The darkness around them was thick, almost tangible, pressing against her skin, as if the room itself was closing in. She reached for the matchbox with trembling hands, desperate to relight the candles, but when her fingers brushed against it, the matchbox felt wrong. Too cold. Like it had been frozen, even though the room had a suffocating warmth to it. "Emily, please, let's just go. This isn't funny anymore." Mia's voice quivered beside her, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, knuckles white. But Emily didn't move. She couldn't. She could still feel the weight of those eyes in the dark, those unblinking, unyielding eyes that seemed to be watching her from the corner of the room. Her breath hitched as she tried to focus on the shapes in the dark, but everything was a blur. It was as though the shadows were shifting, moving, alive. "I don't know, something doesn't feel right," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, even to herself. She reached out in front of her, her hands trembling, trying to find some clue, some sign that they weren't alone. The cold feeling from earlier, the one that had gripped her chest when the figure had appeared, came rushing back. She shuddered, unable to rid herself of the sensation. It was as if something was just beyond her sight, lurking, waiting for her to make a move. Every corner of the room felt like a trap, and Emily was caught in the center of it. And then, the air shifted again. A sharp, distinct sound broke through the silence, a soft, slow scraping, like fingernails running along the wood. The noise came from the farthest corner of the room. The corner where the figure had been. Emily and Mia froze, both of them holding their breath as the noise grew louder, closer. It wasn't just the scraping now. There were faint thuds, as if something was pacing. Something with heavy footsteps. Mia grabbed Emily's arm, her nails digging into her skin, her body rigid with fear. "Emily, please, I can't take this. We have to leave. Right now." Emily couldn't move. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the tension thickening. Her eyes darted to the dark corner where she had seen the figure. There was no movement at first, nothing to suggest that anything was still there, but then, a pair of eyes. At first, it was just a glimmer, two tiny specks of light reflecting from the darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the eyes began to widen, slowly, painfully, as if someone, was watching them from within the dark. "Do you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Mia, her face pale, her body shivering, nodded slowly, unable to tear her eyes away from the haunting glow. What is that? Who's there?" Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. The eyes were too much, too intense. They glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, piercing through the darkness like twin searchlights. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at them, unblinking and cold. The longer Emily stared, the more it felt like they were drawing her in, pulling her closer. But as much as she wanted to look away, she couldn't. Her body refused to obey. The scraping stopped. The thud stopped. The air hung heavy again, as though the world had gone still, holding its breath. "Mia." Emily choked on her words, her mind racing with panic. But before she could finish, a soft whisper filled the room. It was so quiet at first, so faint, that she almost thought she imagined it. But then, louder. Clearer. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was low, cold, and rough, almost like it came from deep within the earth. It sent a shiver of terror down Emily's spine. The voice was not human. It was something darker, older, something that should not exist in the world of the living. Mia shrieked, her voice cracking in fear, her grip tightening on Emily's arm. "What was that? Who is that?" Before Emily could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. She could see her breath in front of her, each exhale turning into a cloud of mist. The room felt like it was freezing over, but not in a natural way, more like something supernatural was pushing the cold into their bones, making it impossible to move. The eyes in the corner never left them. They were bigger now, glowing brighter, the pupils narrowing into slits like those of a predator. Emily tried to step back, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as though an invisible force was holding her in place, freezing her to the spot. "I want to leave," Mia whimpered, her voice breaking as she backed away slowly. "Emily, we need to get out of here. Now." But Emily couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, her mind racing with thoughts that wouldn't come together. What had they unleashed? What was this thing that was watching them? The whispering voice had stopped, but the eyes never blinked, never shifted. They were getting closer. No. They were drawing them closer. Suddenly, the room seemed to tremble. The floor beneath them groaned as if the house itself was alive, as if it had been disturbed by their intrusion. Emily's heart beat faster, a primal fear overtaking her. She was no longer just afraid, she was screaming inside, her mind begging for escape, for safety, for the warmth of daylight. "Mia, we can't stay here," Emily's voice cracked, her throat dry. But just as she opened her mouth to say more, the cold air intensified, rushing in like a violent gust of wind. And then, it happened. The figure, the shadow they had both tried to deny, shifted in the corner, its form becoming more defined, more solid, until a figure of a man, no, a thing, stood before them. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight across its bones. But the worst part? The face. It was blank. Empty. But those eyes, those terrible eyes, were now inches from Emily's face. Emily could feel her mind unraveling as the thing in front of her reached out, its cold fingers grazing her cheek, sending shockwaves of ice through her body. "Mia, run," she managed to choke out, but it was too late. Mia was already frozen in place, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror as the creature stepped forward. But as the creature moved, Emily realized one horrifying truth. It wasn't just watching them. It was coming for them. And there was nowhere to run. The darkness seemed to breathe around them, heavy and suffocating. Emily's lungs burned, struggling to take in air as the creature's eyes bore into her. The cold fingers that had brushed her cheek lingered, leaving behind a trail of frozen terror that spread through her body like a disease. Her legs felt weak, her feet unable to move, as if the very ground beneath her was alive, sucking the strength from her. "Mia! Mia, we need to get out of here now." Emily's voice cracked, desperation clawing at her chest. But Mia didn't respond. She was too still, her face locked in a mask of terror, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at the creature with a mix of disbelief and raw fear. Her body trembled, her fingers twitching as though trying to reach for something, anything, to break free from the nightmare. Emily turned to her, shaking her, her voice rising with panic. "Mia! We have to go. We can't stay here." Mia's lips parted, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. And then, just as Emily began to lose hope, Mia's eyes shifted, meeting Emily's with a look of sheer, paralyzing dread. She whispered, her voice barely audible, I can't feel my legs. It's like they're frozen." The words hit Emily like a slap to the face. She glanced down at Mia's legs, her heart sinking when she saw the frost that had begun to creep up from her feet, coating her ankles, her calves, inch by inch. The cold was spreading, and fast. It was as though something was moving through Mia's body, freezing her from the inside out. "Mia, focus. We need to get out of here now," Emily cried, her panic rising. But Mia was too far gone. Her face had turned an unnatural shade of pale, and the frost was now creeping up her thighs. Emily tried to pull her away, but it was as if Mia's body had become a part of the ice, locked in place by something far stronger than fear. The creature, still looming just inches away, tilted its head slowly to the side, its eyes never leaving Emily. It didn't move, didn't need to. The way it stood, tall and still, with its long, thin limbs and hollow, ghastly expression, was enough to paralyze them both. And yet, it wasn't just its presence that froze them in place. It was the whispering. The whispers had started low, barely a murmur at first, but now they filled the room. They were soft, distant, but growing louder, more insistent with each passing second. Emily could barely make out the words, they seemed to be in a language she didn't understand. It was like a chant, but not a normal chant. The syllables were strange, almost ancient. And the more she listened, the more she realized they weren't just whispers. They were voices. Thousands of them. Each one more terrifying than the last. "Do you hear that?" Mia's voice was a strangled whisper, barely audible beneath the growing hum of the voices. Emily nodded, her eyes wide, her hands shaking as she tried to block out the cacophony. But it wasn't just the sound of the voices that terrified her. It was the feeling. It felt like the walls were closing in, the room itself alive, pulsating with the rhythm of the whispers. And the whispers, they seemed to be coming from all around them, as if the very shadows themselves were speaking. The cold began to deepen, spreading through the room like a poison. Emily could see her breath now, thick clouds of it escaping her lips, but Mia's breath. Mia's breath was gone. Her body had stopped exhaling. Emily reached out, shaking Mia's shoulders, trying to rouse her from whatever trance had overtaken her. Mia! Mia, can you hear me? Snap out of it! Emily screamed, but Mia didn't respond. The creature took a step forward, its long fingers reaching out, brushing against Emily's cheek. The touch was so cold, so impossibly cold, that it burned. It burned through her skin, through her soul, like ice wrapped in fire. She gasped, stumbling backward, but her feet wouldn't move. They were stuck, frozen to the spot, just like Mia's. And then, the whispers changed. They grew louder, sharper, the voices shifting from a chant to something darker. A low, guttural sound rose above the others, one voice more prominent than the rest. It sounded familiar. A name. Emily. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice called her name, slow and deliberate, but it wasn't her own name. It wasn't the voice of anyone she knew. Emily. The voice whispered again, but this time, it wasn't just coming from the shadows. It was coming from inside her mind. The voice echoed in her skull, like it was clawing through the very fabric of her thoughts, digging deep into her consciousness. We know you, Emily. We've been waiting for you. The words didn't make sense, but they didn't need to. She could feel it now, a pull, a pressure building behind her eyes. She was trapped, suffocating under the weight of it. And then, like a switch being flipped, the creature's eyes glowed brighter, flickering as it tilted its head, watching her with unnatural hunger. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Emily's mind spun with terror. Who were these voices? What did they want? Why was she hearing them? Before she could answer, a loud crack echoed through the room. The floor beneath them groaned, a deep, groaning sound like the moaning of the earth itself. The shadows on the walls began to move, to writhe, as if they were alive, alive and hungry. Mia, we have to go. We have to move, Emily pleaded, her voice frantic. But Mia's eyes remained locked on the creature, wide and empty. She wasn't even blinking anymore. Emily's heart pounded louder, her breaths ragged, as the floor beneath her began to shift. The shadows stretched, crawling across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The room was becoming something else. Something worse. And then, the whispers stopped. In the sudden silence, Emily could hear her own heartbeat. It was all she could hear. But that didn't last long. A deep, guttural sound rumbled through the room, from somewhere far beneath the floor, so loud that the walls shook. The shadows surged, twisting violently as if something was pushing through them from below. A voice, a growl, ripped through the silence. Get out. The force of the command struck Emily like a blow. She gasped, the force of it seizing her body. But she couldn't move. She couldn't even scream. The air was thick, suffocating. The darkness was suffocating. And then, Mia's voice broke the silence, a single word, full of raw terror. Run. But as she whispered it, the shadows reached for her, and the room grew colder, darker. Emily had no choice. She turned, her body moving on instinct, her feet pounding against the floor, desperate to escape whatever nightmare was waiting for them. But Mia didn't move. And in that moment, Emily knew something far worse than the creature had happened. Mia was already lost. The sound of Emily's frantic footsteps echoed through the dark, narrow hallway. Her heart pounded, each beat a heavy thud against her chest as she sprinted toward the exit. Her breath was shallow, cold air tearing into her lungs as she pushed herself harder, faster. She had to get out. She had to escape. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Her mind raced, but no matter how quickly she moved, the walls seemed to stretch further and further away. The darkness around her was oppressive, crushing her, closing in on her like the maw of some unseen beast. The low hum of the whispers had begun again, distant but growing stronger with every passing second. They were coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very air around her. The voices were everywhere, insidious, taunting her. "You can't leave, Emily." The words slithered through the air like cold tendrils, wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the nightmare. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, searching for the source. But there was nothing. Just the endless blackness, the faint outlines of the walls flickering in and out of sight like shadows that refused to settle. "You belong here." Her pulse quickened. The voice was so close now, so close it felt like it was inside her head, curling around her thoughts, pushing her closer to madness. The sound of her own heartbeat seemed to drown out everything else, the rhythmic pounding like a clock ticking down to some inevitable doom. She stumbled forward, her body shaking, her legs weak from fear. Her mind was screaming for her to run, but the hallway felt endless, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The air was thick with a freezing chill that gnawed at her skin, and her fingers trembled as they gripped the walls for support. Behind her, she could hear the whispers of the creature, like a dark lullaby, chanting her name, urging her to stop, to turn around. But Emily couldn't. She couldn't afford to listen. With a burst of energy, she forced herself to move faster, pushing through the suffocating darkness, her hands reaching out blindly, feeling for anything that might guide her toward the exit. Her eyes strained against the pitch black, but the dim flickers of light seemed to mock her, vanishing whenever she tried to focus on them. And then, just as hope was starting to fade, Emily's fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. The door. Her heart skipped. She had found it. She had found the way out. But before she could reach for the handle, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The floor shook with a violent force, sending her crashing to her knees. She gasped, trying to steady herself, her fingers gripping the ground as though she could stop the tremors, but the shaking intensified. It felt like the entire building was alive and angry. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice echoed from the walls, louder now, almost deafening. It was everywhere, inside her skull, inside her soul. It twisted, contorted, distorting the air around her, making it thick and suffocating. And then, the shadows on the walls began to move. Not just the walls, but the floor, the ceiling, everything. The shadows rippled, as though something beneath them was stirring, shifting. Slowly at first, then faster, until the darkness took on a form. It was a shape, a shifting figure that moved like liquid, flowing toward her with an unnatural speed. Emily's eyes widened in terror as the figure grew larger, more defined. It was the creature. The one with the eyes that had haunted her every waking moment. The thing that had followed her, that had watched her. And it was here. The whispers grew into guttural growls, voices slithering together, forming a horrible cacophony that filled the space. She could hear them, feel them pressing into her mind, clawing at her thoughts. The creature's eyes gleamed in the darkness, two burning orbs of malevolent light that fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood freeze. Slowly, it began to move toward her, its limbs stretching unnaturally, reaching for her with fingers that were impossibly long and thin, like knives coming out of the shadows. Emily scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she reached for the door handle. She had to get out, she had to get out. The door was the only thing that stood between her and the nightmare that was closing in on her. But as her hand gripped the handle, it felt wrong. It was ice cold, colder than anything she had ever felt before, as though the metal itself was alive with a cruel, biting chill. And then, the door wouldn't budge. Emily's breath hitched. She tugged harder, panic rising in her chest as she pulled at the handle, but it was as if the door had become part of the wall itself, fused into the darkness. Her body shook with terror, and she screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the empty space. "You're not going anywhere, Emily." The voice was so close now, and she could feel it, feel its presence crawling along her spine, chilling her to the bone. The creature's eyes were burning into her soul, and she knew that if she didn't escape now, she would never escape at all. She pulled again, with all her strength, her muscles straining, her fingers raw from the cold metal, but it didn't move. The door had become a wall. And that was when she heard it, the soft click of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate. She spun around, her eyes wide, her heart leaping into her throat. The creature was right there, just behind her, its breath cold against her neck. She could feel its presence pressing in, filling the air with an unbearable pressure. The shadows shifted again, closing in on her like a cage. "It's too late, Emily." And that was when she realized. The hallway wasn't real. The walls, the door, the creature, they were all part of something far worse than she had ever imagined. It was all an illusion. The whispers had been pulling her deeper into this nightmare, feeding on her fear, drawing her into the very heart of the darkness. She wasn't trapped in the building. She was trapped in her own mind. And as the creature's fingers brushed against her skin, Emily understood that there was no escape. Not from it. Not from herself. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest, every beat a drum of impending doom. She could feel the creature behind her, its icy breath tickling the back of her neck. But when she turned, it wasn't there. It was gone, vanished into the shadows. But that didn't ease the panic rising within her. Something was wrong. The hallway had changed. It was no longer a simple corridor, but something far darker, more twisted. The walls seemed to bend and warp in ways that defied logic. The door, the only way out, was now completely gone, swallowed by the darkness. The coldness in the air was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Emily's limbs felt heavy, as if the darkness itself was weighing her down. She staggered, her feet slipping against the cold, slick floor. She reached out for support, her hands grasping for anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. It was as though the world itself had become unsteady, as if the very ground beneath her had turned into a shifting mass of shadows. And then she saw it. A mirror. It stood at the far end of the hallway, its glass surface shimmering eerily in the faint light. Emily's eyes locked onto it, drawn by an unseen force, as though the mirror itself was calling to her. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to get away from whatever was drawing her toward it. But her feet moved of their own accord, dragging her forward, unable to resist. As she drew closer, the air grew colder. Her breath came out in visible puffs, the chill biting into her skin. She stopped just in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, her wide eyes filled with terror. But something wasn't right. Her reflection, it wasn't quite the same. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the reflection was wrong. Her own eyes were empty, hollow, as if something had drained all the life from them. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her hair hung limp around her face, as if it too had been touched by the darkness. She reached out a trembling hand toward the glass, the surface cool against her fingertips. But as soon as her hand touched the mirror, the reflection shifted. Her reflection smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that twisted her features into something monstrous. The smile wasn't hers. It was wrong. Her hand jerked back as if burned, but the reflection didn't stop. It continued to smile, its expression growing more sinister with every passing second. Emily's chest tightened. There was something in that smile, something alive, something watching her. The longer she stared, the more she felt as though her reflection was not just a mirror image, but a separate entity, something trapped inside, something waiting for her to make a mistake. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing hum in her ears. And that's when the reflection's smile faded. The eyes, those hollow, black eyes, shifted, and in an instant, the reflection wasn't just mimicking her movements. It was moving on its own. Her heart skipped a beat. It reached out of the mirror, its hand pressing against the glass. Emily backed away, her pulse roaring in her ears as she stared at the impossibility before her. The mirror was not just reflecting her anymore. It was alive, and whatever was in there, whatever was reaching out to her, wasn't human. The fingers on the other side of the glass tapped lightly, once, twice. The sound was soft, hollow, and it echoed in the silence of the hallway like a warning. The image of her reflection, it changed. It was no longer just a distorted version of her, it was something else entirely. The figure in the mirror had her features, but it was twisted. Dark shadows seemed to curl and writhe beneath its skin, as though something was alive within it, feeding off her fear. Her own voice, came from the reflection, distorted and hollow. "You shouldn't have looked at me, Emily." Emily stumbled backward, her legs weak, her eyes never leaving the glass. The reflection's mouth twisted again, stretching into a grotesque snarl that didn't belong to her. A cold, familiar dread filled her. She had heard that voice before. It had whispered to her in the darkness, in the corners of her mind. It was the same voice that had followed her from the moment she stepped into this nightmare. "Leave me alone. I didn't do anything. I just wanted to." Before she could finish her sentence, the reflection's hand slammed against the glass, sending a jolt of ice-cold terror through her body. The sound of it echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the walls, and for a moment, Emily felt like the entire building itself was closing in on her. The glass beneath her hand was freezing now, colder than before, and her fingers numbed as they gripped it, unwillingly, desperately. The figure inside the mirror leaned closer. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, far too wide for its face, revealing jagged, blood-stained teeth. The reflection's voice echoed in her mind, its whispers like 1,000 nails scratching across her skull. "You can't escape me, Emily. You belong to me now." Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, a pressure so intense that she gasped, clutching at her ribs. She stumbled backward, her body racked with pain as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Her vision blurred, the world around her spinning. The sound of the creature's voice, its cold, mocking tone, filled her ears, drowning out everything else. Her body shook uncontrollably as the shadow in the mirror reached out again, its fingers stretching through the glass like liquid, impossibly long and thin, grabbing at her wrist. She screamed, pulling away, but its grip tightened, pulling her closer to the mirror. No escape. The whispers, the shadows, they were everywhere now, closing in on her from all directions. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling in fear, her heart thudding in her chest. Her fingers scraped against the glass, her nails tearing at the surface, trying to claw her way out, but the reflection held her fast. She felt herself being pulled, deeper and deeper into the glass, into the darkness beyond. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the mirror went silent. The hand was gone. The reflection was still, lifeless once more. But Emily didn't move. She couldn't. Her heart raced, her breath shallow. The fear had paralyzed her. And then, a voice, familiar, comforting, came from behind her. "Emily." She turned, her eyes wild. But there was no one there. Only the darkness. The voice whispered again, colder this time. "You can't run from me." The shadows began to crawl again, filling the space around her, slowly, deliberately. The creature was still here. Still watching. And there was nowhere left to hide. Emily's heart was pounding in her chest, but now it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. Something primal. The air around her felt heavy, thick with a suffocating presence that pressed in from all sides. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if something invisible was choking her, silencing her every attempt. The walls felt like they were closing in. She could hear the house groaning as if it were alive, its bones creaking under the weight of a terrible thing hiding within. The darkness around her wasn't just the absence of light. No, it was far worse. It was a presence, a living, breathing force that moved with her, followed her every step. It crept up her legs, across her arms, brushing lightly against her skin, sending waves of terror through her. It felt like cold fingers grazing her, the chill crawling under her skin. Suddenly, the hallway shifted. The space that once seemed familiar now felt foreign, distorted. The door she had once come through was gone, the windows had vanished, and the only thing in front of her was a mirror, shattered and cracked, its frame standing like a dark sentinel at the far end. Emily didn't know what it was about that mirror, but she knew she had to reach it. If she could just get to it, maybe she could break free from whatever was trapping her here. She ran, but no matter how fast she moved, the mirror stayed out of reach, its reflection mocking her, growing smaller the closer she got. Panic surged within her. She could feel it now, the darkness thickening, closing in, its grasp tightening around her. The air was colder, the shadows darker, and every step she took made her feel like she was sinking deeper into something she couldn't escape. And then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere, from all directions, deep and guttural, a low rumble that vibrated through the very ground beneath her. "You'll never escape me, Emily." The words sent a jolt of terror through her. The sound was suffocating, heavy, a presence she could not outrun. She stumbled forward, her feet unsteady as the shadows seemed to pull at her, trying to drag her down. But the mirror, she had to reach the mirror. It was the only way. She pushed herself harder, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her legs screaming in pain. The distance between her and the mirror stretched, no matter how much she ran, and the shadows seemed to mock her efforts, growing thicker with every step. And then the darkness lunged. It came from every corner, a mass of cold, writhing shadows that pressed in on her, their hands, no, not hands, claws, long and cold, sinking into her skin. She screamed in horror, her voice swallowed by the consuming blackness that wrapped around her. She tried to pull away, but it was useless. The grip tightened. The shadows were pulling her in, dragging her down into the abyss. Her hand reached out, desperate, trembling as it made contact with the cold, smooth surface of the mirror. She thought she saw something, a flash of light, a glimpse of the way out, but before she could react, the mirror cracked with a loud, deafening sound. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, falling to the floor like rain. The shadows surged forward, swallowing her whole, pulling her deeper into the dark. "No!" Emily screamed as the darkness consumed her, dragging her down, down into the depths. The last thing she heard was that voice again, closer now, whispering in her ear, "You belong to me now." Suddenly, her world changed. Emily's eyes fluttered open, but the world she saw now was nothing like before. The air was thick, the cold biting into her skin. She was no longer in the house, in the hallway, she was in a place far worse. The darkness here was alive. It pulsated with a malignant energy, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her. She tried to move, to scream, but her body felt heavy, trapped in some invisible force. Her limbs were paralyzed, her breath shallow. There was no sound, only the oppressive silence that smothered her. And then, she heard it. The voice. Familiar. But not Emily. It whispered, soft and ominous. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned, but there was nothing there. No figure. No shadow. Just the suffocating blackness. The voice came again, a bit louder this time, and it sent a chill down her spine. "You can't run from me." She shuddered, but before she could react, she felt it. The coldness, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing right behind her. Something was there, just out of her sight. Its presence pressed against her, the chill of its breath on her neck. She turned, but there was nothing. No figure. No shape. Just the infinite void around her. And then, she saw it. A figure in the distance. She couldn't tell if it was real or just another trick of the dark, but it was moving toward her. Slowly. Relentlessly. At first, she thought it was another person, maybe someone who could help her. But as it drew closer, her blood ran cold. It was her. But it wasn't. The figure was a distorted, twisted version of Emily herself, its eyes hollow, dark, as if they had seen things no human ever should. The figure moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. "You will never leave," the voice hissed, now coming from the figure. "You are mine." The world around Emily began to warp, the air thick with suffocating dread. She felt the grip of the shadows again, this time tighter, more insistent. No matter where she ran, no matter how fast she moved, it always followed. The twisted version of herself grew closer, its face warped into something horrifying, something inhuman. "You can't escape me," it said again, its voice echoing, reverberating through the space. "You belong here, with me." Emily reached out, but the figure's touch was ice cold, and the moment her fingers brushed against it, everything went dark. The last thing she heard was that voice, no longer a whisper, but a scream. "You'll never leave." And then, nothing.